Graham Wexler did not spill the broth. He poured it. Slowly, deliberately, with a small cold smile on his face, while the entire private dining room watched and said nothing. Pot was full. The liquid had been simmering for 40 minutes. And when it came down across Aaliyah Monroe's right arm, she did not scream. She pressed her lips together so hard they went white, grabbed the nearest linen napkin, and kept standing. Because she needed the job, because her daughter was 6 years old and asleep, 7 blocks away in an apartment owned by Graham's father. Because every face in that room was telling her, without saying a single word, that what had just happened would be whatever they decided it was. If you have ever been hurt by someone who knew you couldn't fight back, someone who hurt you because they could stay with this story, because it belongs to you too. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit like and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The Sterling house did not look like a place where people got away with things. That was part of its function. It occupied the ground floor of a pre-war building on the Upper East Side, the kind of address that appeared in no online review and required a name to get past the front door. The dining room held 18 tables, each spaced far enough apart that conversation stayed private. The lighting was low and warm. The walls were paneled in pale ash wood. Everything about the room communicated restraint, and restraint, in Manhattan, communicated money. Aaliyah Monroe had worked there for 3 years. She was 28, slender in the way that people who are always moving and never fully eating tend to be slender, and she had a quality about her that regular customers recognized without being able to name. She was completely present. When she stood at your table, she was not somewhere else. She wasn't calculating her tip, or worrying about the next table, or mentally rehearsing an argument she'd had that morning. She was there. She looked at you. She remembered what you ordered last time, and whether you preferred your water still or sparkling, and she never made you feel like you'd inconvenienced her by existing. That quality had taken her 3 years to develop into something that paid rent. She had started as a busser, moved to food runner, and earned the waitress position after 18 months of watching and learning every detail of a restaurant that ran like a private club with tablecloths. She was good at it. She was also a single mother. Nyla was 6, small for her age, and completely convinced that she and her mother were going to open a bakery together someday. She had decided this at age 4 after watching a cooking video on Aaliyah's phone, and she had not wavered since. Every time Aaliyah came home from a double shift, smelling of stock and dish soap and other people's perfume, Nyla would be at the kitchen table with flour on her elbows, attempting something she had seen on YouTube, waiting to announce that their bakery needed to have a specific kind of cookie in the front window so people walking by would smell it and stop. Aaliyah always tasted whatever Nyla made, always told her it was coming along. She kept the dream alive because Nyla needed it to be alive. And she kept working Sterling house doubles because dreaming alone didn't pay Con Edison. The night everything changed, she was covering a private party in the upstairs dining room. Graham Wexler had booked it 3 weeks in advance. 14 guests, a tasting menu, 2 sommeliers, and a very specific instruction passed down through Sterling house management. Whatever, Mr. Wexler wants, Mr. Wexler gets. Graham was 31. He had never held a job he hadn't been handed. His father's name opened every door in his life, and he had walked through all of them with the particular confidence of a man who had never once experienced a consequence. He was not stupid. That was the thing people misread about him. Stupid men were sometimes manageable. Graham was sharp enough to understand exactly what he was doing, and do it anyway, because he'd learned, through years of watching his father operate, that the rules were simply suggestions for people who couldn't afford better lawyers. He had approached Aaliyah earlier in the evening, while the other guests were deep in their own conversations, stood too close, said things that were technically dyeable but unmistakably clear in their intent. When she stepped back and kept her voice professionally neutral and declined in the way that service workers learn to decline firmly, without giving him anything he could quote back to management, his face went very still. That stillness was the warning she didn't have enough experience to read. An hour later, she was carrying a pot of broth to the serving station near his end of the table. He reached out as she passed. Not clumsy, not an accident, His hand connected with the underside of the pot with the deliberate geometry of someone who had already decided what was about to happen. The broth came down her right arm. It was not a splash. It was a sustained pour, and she felt the temperature register in her skin before the pain caught up, felt it go from hot to burning, to something beyond burning, felt her entire arm become a single, continuous signal of damage while the room went silent. And Graham leaned back in his chair and said, with that same cool steadiness, "Watch where you're going." She did not scream. She wanted to. The sound was there in her chest, pressing up against her sternum like something alive. But Nyla was 7 blocks away, and this job was the roof over her daughter's head, and her brain, trained by 3 years of Sterling House service and a childhood that had taught her that losing control in front of powerful people never ended in her favor, kept that sound exactly where it was. She excused herself. She went to the kitchen bathroom and ran cold water over her arm for 6 minutes because she had read somewhere that you were supposed to do that. And she pressed her forehead against the wall tiles. And she breathed through her nose until the sound in her chest went back down. Then she dried off, wrapped a clean kitchen towel around her arm, and went back to work. Because the shift wasn't over. Because she needed the money. Because nobody in that room was going to help her. Owen Price found her at the end of the night. He was 23, Korean American, had been working kitchen prep at Sterling House for 8 months, and was the kind of person who noticed things that most people trained themselves not to see. He noticed the way Aaliyah's right hand wasn't moving right. He noticed that she was holding her tray differently, compensating with her left arm and her hip. He pulled her into the back hallway near the loading dock and made her show him. What was underneath the towel was bad. Owen had grown up in a household where his mother, a home health aide, talked about burns and infections, the way other people talked about the weather, and what he was looking at on Aaliyah's arm had already gone past the point of first aid. "You need a hospital," he said. "I need this job," she said. "And the hospital asks questions." She already understood what was about to happen. She had seen it before, not to herself, but to others in service work, in low-margin apartments, in situations where a powerful person decided to rewrite the terms of an event after it was over. She had seen how quickly the story changed when the powerful person had lawyers and the other person had rent due. Owen stood there, looking at her arm, and then at her face, and then he did something that took Aaliyah completely off guard. He pulled out his phone. He had taken a picture. Seconds after the broth came down, before he'd fully processed what he was seeing, his hands had moved on instinct, the same instinct that made him document the spoiled produce delivery last March, that management had tried to pass off as a receiving error. He hadn't known he was going to need it. He just knew that what he'd seen didn't look like an accident. The photograph was blurry, taken quickly, slightly out of focus, the angle imperfect. But you could see Graham's arm extended. You could see the trajectory. You could see Aaliyah's face in the half-second before the pain registered, when she still looked confused, because part of her brain hadn't caught up to what was happening. Owen sent it to her phone. Aaliyah stood in the back hallway of Sterling House, holding a picture of the moment her life changed, and she felt something complicated move through her, something that was grief and fury, and a cold, practical fear, all pressed together into a shape she didn't have a name for yet. She put the phone in her pocket. She went home. She did not go to a hospital. She wrapped her arm in clean bandages from the drugstore across from her building, took 3 ibuprofen, sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours after Nyla fell asleep, and figured out the math of her situation. The math was not good. She lived in a building owned by Wexler Properties. She worked at a restaurant where Victor Wexler was a major stakeholder and whose management had learned long ago that keeping Victor happy was a more reliable career strategy than keeping the staff safe. The restaurant physician, a man named Nathaniel Crow, who came in twice a month and mainly handled the kind of incidents that management preferred not to document properly, had been informed by morning. By the time Aaliyah received a call asking her to come in and get looked at, the story had already been written. Employee negligence, unsafe handling of kitchen equipment, a regrettable accident. She sat in Crow's small examination room while he avoided looking directly at her arm and wrote things down on a form she wasn't allowed to read. When she asked him what he was writing, he said, "Just standard documentation," and kept writing. She asked him if she could get a copy. He said the practice kept records on file. She asked him again, differently, specifically, whether what was on that form reflected what had actually happened. He set down his pen. He looked at the wall above her left shoulder. He said, "Ms. Monroe, I think it's important that we all remember that accidents happen in busy kitchens." She understood then exactly where she was. Victor Wexler came to Sterling House 3 days later. He did not do what she expected. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He was a man in his late 60s with the physical solidity of someone who had spent decades building things. And he came to her table in the employee break room with the measured manner of a man delivering unpleasant news about a weather forecast. He told her that the official record of the incident had been filed. He told her that Sterling House valued her as an employee and hoped she would continue to recover well. Asanine. He told her that Wexler Properties was committed to maintaining affordable housing in Manhattan and that her lease renewal, which was coming up in 6 weeks, was something the company wanted to make sure went smoothly. He did not connect those last 2 sentences explicitly. He didn't need to. When he left, Aaliyah sat in the break room for 11 minutes before she could stand up. She signed the statement that afternoon. For 21 days after that, she wrapped her arm in heavy bandages and went to work. The infection set in during the 2nd week. She could feel it. A heat that was different from the original burn. A wrongness that throbbed and spread and didn't respond to the ibuprofen the way it had at first. Her fingers were swelling. The skin around the wound had gone from an angry red to something darker, something that made her avoid looking at it directly. When she changed the bandages at night, she knew what an untreated infection meant. She also knew what losing her apartment meant for a 6-year-old who had already been through too many disruptions to count. So she went to work. She learned to carry trays differently. She positioned herself so that her right arm was the one away from the customers. She smiled and took orders and refilled glass and cleared plates. And when the arm kept her up at night with its heat and its throbbing, she pressed her face into her pillow and told herself that Nyla's school was 6 blocks from their apartment. And Nyla had friends in the building, and disrupting that, losing that, was not a trade she was willing to make. Nobody at Sterling House asked about her arm directly. Dennis Corbett, the restaurant manager, had a talent for not seeing things that were inconvenient to see. The other servers knew what happened. The story had moved through the staff at the speed of bad news, and they gave Aaliyah the particular careful kindness of people who understood the situation and understood that there was nothing any of them could do about it without risking their own positions. She did not blame them. She understood the math they were doing. She was doing the same math herself. What she hadn't accounted for was the table in Section 3. He came in on a Wednesday evening in November, when the restaurant was 3/4 full, and the energy had the low, comfortable hum of a midweek crowd that knew exactly what it wanted. He arrived alone, was seated by the host without ceremony, and ordered sparkling water. He did not open the menu immediately. He sat with the stillness of a man who did not require distraction. His name was Kang Jun-ho, though Aaliyah did not know that yet. She knew his table number and his sparkling water preference, and the fact that he had a way of looking at the room that was different from the way most people looked at rooms. Most people looked at the room. He appeared to be reading it. He was 41, Korean American. He wore a dark suit that was precisely fitted without announcing itself, and he carried the quality that truly dangerous people sometimes carry, which is the absolute absence of the need to prove anything to anyone. He was not performing calm. He simply was it. He had come to Sterling House for Victor Wexler. That was the thing Aaliyah wouldn't learn. Until much later, Jun-ho had been building a file on Victor for longer than she had been working at the restaurant. His mother, a Korean immigrant woman who had come to America with nothing and worked with everything she had spent 6 years inside one of Wexler's industrial laundry facilities, where the chemicals were wrong and the ventilation was worse, and the management philosophy was built on that replacement workers cost less than safety improvements. When illness compromised her productivity, Victor discarded her with the efficiency of a man disposing of broken equipment. She died 14 months later, in a room she shared with 2 other women, while Jun-ho was 21 years old and had just started building the foundation of what would become an organization that powerful men were careful not to cross. He had never stopped keeping track of Victor. He had learned patience, the way some men learn violence slowly over years, as a survival skill that eventually became simply who they were. Tonight he was looking for something. A crack. A witness. Something that could be pried open into something larger. What he found was a waitress who was carrying her right arm wrong. He watched her across 4 tables in 12 minutes before she came to him. Watched the way she adjusted her gait before picking up anything heavier than a water pitcher. Watched the way she held her shoulders slightly raised on the right side, the micro-compensation of someone managing pain that they had decided had no right to slow them down. He watched her face when she thought no one was watching her face, and what he saw there was not the expression of someone who had hurt themselves and was healing. It was something harder, something that had been decided against. When she came to his table, she was professional, warm without being performative. She took his dinner order without writing it down, which meant she had been doing this long enough to trust her memory, and she was about to leave when he asked, quietly enough that no one at adjacent tables could hear, "Who did that to your arm?" She stopped. He watched the muscles in her jaw tighten, watched her reassemble, the professional expression erupted. That the question had briefly disrupted, watched her do in real time the calculation that she had been doing for 21 days. How much trouble could the truth create, and was the relief of telling it worth that price? Occupational hazard, she said. Kitchen accident. That's what the form says, he replied. She looked at him then. Actually looked at him, not the practiced service industry version of eye contact, but a real look. The kind that was trying to figure out what kind of threat she was dealing with. He held it, didn't explain himself, didn't look away. "Can I get you anything else?" she said. "I'm fine," he said. "Thank you." She left. He ate his dinner. He did not approach her again during service. He tipped 30%, which was generous, but not the kind of generous that was trying to buy something, and he was gone before the restaurant closed. Except he wasn't. Aaliyah came out the staff entrance at 11:40 with her coat on and her bag over her left shoulder, and Junho was standing 20 feet away in the November cold, not blocking her path, just present. She stopped. "I don't want trouble," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not here to give you any." "Then what are you here for?" He was quiet for a moment. The street was mostly empty. A cab moved through the intersection at the end of the block. Somewhere down, the way a restaurant was doing last call, and they could hear it faintly glass and voices and someone laughing. "I know Victor Wexler," he said, not the way he'd want people to know him. "I know how his operation works. I know what he does when someone creates a problem for him." Aaliyah's hand tightened on the strap of her bag. "You need to tell me to leave," he said, "and I'll leave. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me get you medical attention tonight, because what's under those bandages is not going to get better on its own, and you already know that." She looked at him for a long time. The thing about the wall she had built, the one that had been holding for 21 days, through the falsified forms and the landlord's implications, and the nights she changed her bandages at 2 a.m. and didn't let herself cry. Because Nyla was in the next room, and Nyla needed to believe that her mother had a handle on things. The thing about that wall was that it had been built in emergency, maintained by sheer will, and it was not actually a wall. It was more like a dam, and it had been under pressure this entire time. And Junho was the first person in 21 days who had looked directly at her and acknowledged, without being asked, without being prompted, without her having to perform any version of okayness at all, that what was under those bandages was not okay. Something in her face changed. Not broke. Changed. "My daughter is home," she said. "We'll call someone to stay with her," he said. "Or she comes with us. Whatever you need." Aaliyah stood on the November sidewalk outside Sterling House, with her arm burning inside its bandages, and her daughter waiting at home, and a man she didn't know offering to do the one thing that 21 days of fear had prevented her from doing, and she tried to calculate the risk. She couldn't do it anymore. She was too tired to do the math. "Show me your ID," she said. He produced it without hesitation. She looked at it, handed it back. "If my daughter is scared," Aaliyah said, "we leave. No matter what." "Understood," he said. She called her neighbor Mrs. Delgado, who had watched Nyla before in emergencies and who picked up on the second ring, and said, "Of course, go. Don't worry." Aaliyah texted her the door code and got into the car that Jun-ho directed her to. Not a limousine, not anything theatrical, just a black sedan, with a driver who didn't speak, and as they pulled away from the curb, she stared at the passing city and felt the dam finally do what dams do when you stop fighting the water. She told him everything. Not all at once. Not organized. She told him the way people tell things when they have been holding them for too long in chunks, out of order, going back to fill in pieces she'd skipped, sometimes stopping mid-sentence because the thing she was about to say was something she hadn't said out loud to anyone, and hearing it in her own voice was different from the version she'd been carrying inside. She told him about Graham, about the broth, about the 11 minutes in the break room after Victor left, about the form she signed, about the photograph in her wallet. Jun-ho listened. He didn't tell her it was going to be okay. He didn't tell her she was brave. He didn't fill the silences with reassurance that would have felt, coming from a stranger, like performance. He listened in the specific way that people who are genuinely dangerous sometimes listen completely, without agenda, storing everything and giving nothing back until he had the full picture. When she finished, the car was pulling up outside a brownstone in a neighborhood she didn't recognize. "The physician inside is someone I trust," he said. "She'll look at the arm. Whatever she recommends, that's what happens. No negotiation." Aaliyah looked at the building. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Jun-ho was quiet for a moment. "Because someone hurt you in front of a room full of people and every single one of them decided they hadn't seen it," he said. "And I did see it. It wasn't the whole truth. She would learn the rest of it later. But in that moment, in that car, exhausted and in pain and more scared than she had allowed herself to fully feel for 21 days, it was enough. She opened the door. She went inside. The physician's name was Dr. Sung, and she had the practical, unshockable manner of someone who had been treating injuries that polite society preferred not to discuss for a very long time. She cut away the bandages without commentary, examined the arm with a methodical thoroughness that told Aaliyah she was someone who understood what she was looking at, and when she was done, she looked up and spoke with the directness of someone who had decided years ago that softening bad news didn't actually make it better. The infection had gone deep. There was tissue involvement that shouldn't be there. Without immediate treatment, not tomorrow, not after Aaliyah's next shift tonight, there was a genuine possibility of permanent damage to the tendons of her right hand. There was a possibility of something worse than that if the infection continued to spread. Aaliyah sat on the examination table and looked at her arm. She thought about Nyla's bakery. She thought about the first tray of cookies her daughter wanted to pull from the oven herself someday, and how to do that you needed 2 working hands, and how she had been putting her hand at risk for 21 days because a man with more money than her had decided. His humiliation mattered more than her body. She looked at Jun-ho, who was standing near the door where she could see him, but far enough away to not crowd her. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" Dr. Sung confirmed. "Do whatever needs to be done," Aaliyah said. She did not know then that the decision she was making in that examination room was the first in a sequence that would take down a man who had spent decades building himself into something untouchable. She did not know what was coming. The testimony, the federal investigators, the collapse of an empire built on the belief that the people it hurt would never be believed. All she knew was that her arm hurt, and someone had finally refused to pretend it didn't. In her wallet, underneath Nyla's school photograph, Owen Price's blurry picture waited. The angle was imperfect. The focus was slightly off. It was enough. Dr. Sung worked on Aaliyah's arm for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Jun-ho sat in the waiting room, outside, and did not check his phone once. That was the thing Aaliyah noticed afterward, when Dr. Sung came to get him, and he stood up immediately. Not the controlled rise of a man who had been waiting impatiently and was relieved it was over, but the immediate, unguarded movement of someone who had simply been there the entire time, fully present, not managing anything. His phone was face down on the chair beside him. Whatever was on it, and a man who ran what he ran would have things on his phone at midnight that required attention, had waited. Dr. Sung told him what she had told Aaliyah. The infection had been debrided, the damaged tissue cleaned. There was a course of IV antibiotics that would need to continue now for next 72 hours, followed by oral medication for 2 weeks, followed by careful monitoring determined by careful monitoring to determine whether the tendon damage was additional intervention. The words additional intervention meant something specific, that doctor. Sung did not spell out in front of Aaliyah, but that Aaliyah understood perfectly well. There was a version of this where her right hand never fully came back. She did not say that to Jun-ho. She didn't need to. He'd heard the same words she had. They put her in a room off the main corridor of the brownstone, a plain room, with a bed and a lamp and clean linens, and doctor. Sung attached the IV line and told her to sleep and not argue about it. Aaliyah almost made a joke about being in a stranger's house with a tube in her arm and an organization's worth of muscle somewhere outside the door. She stopped herself because she was too tired, and the anesthetic doctor. Sung had used to clean the wound, was making the edges of her thoughts soft. Texted Mrs. Delgado. Everything okay. Could be a few hours. Thank you. The reply came in 40 seconds. Nyla's asleep. Take your time, Mija. Aaliyah set the phone on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the statement she'd signed. She thought about how her hand had been shaking when she signed it and how she'd told herself that she was being practical, that she was protecting Nyla, that sometimes protecting the people you love meant swallowing things that tasted like acid. She thought about how she'd believed, somewhere under the practical calculation, that if she was quiet enough and careful enough and didn't make trouble, it would eventually be over. 21 days of a burning arm had taught her what over actually meant to people like Victor Wexler. She closed her eyes. She slept. In the morning, Junho was in the kitchen of the brownstone making coffee. When she came downstairs with the IV pole still attached to her arm and her hair loose from its braid, and the particular expression of someone who had slept deeply for the first time in weeks and wasn't sure how to feel about that. He handed her a cup without asking how she took it. She looked at it. Black, she said. I know, he said. You had it black at table 3. She sat down at the kitchen table. The room was plain, functional, the kind of space that was used rather than decorated. I need to get home to Nyla, she said. I know, he said. Dr. Sung wants to check the arm first. 20 minutes. And then what? He set his own cup down. He sat across from her. In the morning light, he looked less like the version of himself she'd seen in the restaurant list constructed, less the product of the specific discipline that powerful men learn to project in public spaces. He looked tired, actually. Not the exhaustion of someone who'd had a long night, but something older than that. That depends on you, he said. Meaning what? Meaning you have a photograph and a falsified medical report and a restaurant manager who knows exactly what happened and a kitchen worker who watched it happen. That's more than most people have when they go up against Victor Wexler. He paused. It's also not nothing to lose if Victor decides to move first. Aaliyah wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Her right hand was bandaged from the wrist to partway up the forearm, and the fingers moved stiffly, but they moved. That felt important. You said you know Victor, she said. Not the way he'd want people to know him. Yes. What does that mean exactly? Junho was quiet for a moment, in the way that she was starting to recognize meant he was deciding how much of something to give her. Not because he was dishonest, but because he was careful. It means I've been watching him for a long time, he said. Long enough to know that what happened to you wasn't the first time he buried something. It's not the second or the fifth. He's been doing this for decades. Workers, tenants, employees who saw things they weren't supposed to see. He has a method. It works because the people he uses it on are usually isolated. They think they're alone. I am alone, Aaliyah says. You were, he said. She looked at him across the table. You don't know me, she said. No, he agreed. But I know what Victor did to someone I knew. And I know what it looks like when a person has been carrying something that was put on them by force. She didn't ask him to explain that yet. She filed it. If I fight this, she said, he moves on my apartment. My job is already gone the second I open my mouth. Yes. And you're going to tell me you can fix that. I'm going to tell you I can make sure you and your daughter are not on the street while you figure out what you want to do, he said. That's not the same thing as fixing it. I don't have a version of this where nothing costs anything. Aaliyah looked at him for a long time. Why, she said. I'm not a political problem for you. I'm not an asset. What do you actually get from this? The silence that followed was not evasive. It was the silence of someone locating the true answer under several layers of easier ones. Victor Wexler killed my mother, Junho said. Not directly. Indirectly, the way powerful people do things, through negligence and calculation, and the decision that the labor of people like her was worth extracting until there was nothing left to extract, and then discarding what remained. She worked in one of his industrial facilities for 6 years. When she got sick, he terminated her contract. She had no recourse. She died 14 months later. He picked up his cup. I've been building a case against him for 20 years. What I have is financial records, witness accounts, corporate documentation enough to make his lawyers work hard, but not enough, by itself, to take him apart completely. What I've always needed is someone inside his operation willing to stand up and say what happened to them directly. Aaliyah absorbed this. So I am an asset, she said. You're a person who was wronged, he said. And yes, your testimony could be part of what finally brings him down. Both things are true. I'm not going to pretend the second one doesn't exist. She hadn't expected that. The honesty of it sat differently than reassurance would have. I need to think, she said. Take whatever time you need, he said. Dr. Sung came in 20 minutes later, checked the arm, redressed it, and told Aaliyah that the infection was responding, but that she needed to stay off it as much as possible for at least another week. Not Sterling house shifts, not carrying trays, not pretending it was fine. I can't afford a week off, Aaliyah said. You can't afford to lose the use of your right hand, doctor, Sung said, with the flatness of someone who had said variations of this sentence many times and had stopped softening it, because softening it didn't help. Aaliyah didn't argue. Junho drove her back to her apartment building himself. Not the sedan and the silent driver. He drove a plain car, nothing announcing itself. When they pulled up outside, he stayed in the car while she got out, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she turned back. The photograph I have, she said. Owen's picture. Would that be enough to open a federal investigation, combined with the falsified medical report and at least one corroborating witness? Yes, he said. Possibly. She nodded slowly. I'll be in touch, she said. She went inside. Nyla was awake and in the kitchen attempting pancakes, which were going in a direction that required immediate adult intervention. Alicia stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her daughter negotiate with a pan that was too hot and batter that was too thin, and felt something move through her chest that was not quite pain and not quite relief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Mom! Nyla turned around, took in the bandaged arm, which Aaliyah had made no effort to hide. Is that new? It looks bigger. I saw a doctor, Aaliyah said. A real one? The realest kind. Nyla looked at her with the specific assessment of a 6-year-old who has been paying closer attention to adult behavior than adults tend to assume. Does it hurt less? Working on it, Aaliyah said. She came into the kitchen and saved the pancakes. Move over. Let me show you the temperature thing again. They cooked together. Nyla ate 4 pancakes and announced that she needed to adjust the recipe for their future bakery because the bubbles were appearing too slowly. Aaliyah drank 2 cups of coffee and did not tell her daughter that the future bakery was in jeopardy in about 17 different ways. She listened to Nyla's analysis of the bubble situation. She nodded in the right places. She thought about the signed statement in Victor Wexler's files. She thought about Owen's blurry photograph in her wallet. She thought about a Korean woman who worked in an industrial laundry until there was nothing left of her. 3 days later, Victor Wexler's property manager called to inform her that her lease renewal required some additional documentation that had not previously been necessary and that there was a 96-hour window to provide it before. The renewal process would need to be reassessed. Aaliyah knew what that meant. It meant Victor had noticed she hadn't come back to work. It meant his attention had sharpened. She called Junho. He answered on the second ring. He's moving on the apartment, she said. How long do you have? 4 days. Pack what matters, he said. I'll send someone this afternoon. I'm not running, she said immediately. I know. This isn't running. This is not letting him use your daughter as leverage while you make decisions. A pause. There's a house outside the city. Quiet. Secure. Nobody connects it to me or to anything Victor would be watching. You and Nyla stay there while we figure out the next steps. You keep control of every decision. Aaliyah stood in her kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear and looked around at the apartment she had filled, over 3 years, with Nyla's artwork on the refrigerator and a second-hand coffee maker that she'd repaired twice because she couldn't afford to replace it, and the specific accumulated evidence of a life built carefully from limited materials. This is my home, she said. I know, he said. She closed her eyes. 4 days, she said. I'll send someone at 2. Packed that evening. 2 bags for herself. 1 large bag for Nyla, which Nyla supervised with extreme seriousness, vetoing anything she considered non-essential, and insisting on bringing a jar of her experimental cookie dough that was currently occupying the top shelf of the refrigerator. Aaliyah let her bring it. The house outside the city was 40 minutes north, in a town so small it had 1 stoplight. The house itself was set back from the road, behind a screen of old trees, and inside it was plain and clean, and had a kitchen that was larger than anything Aaliyah had cooked in, since she was a girl staying with her aunt in Georgia. Nyla discovered the kitchen within 6 minutes of arriving and declared it perfect. Junho did not stay. He made sure they were settled, made sure the refrigerator was stocked, showed Aaliyah how the security system worked and where the nearest urgent care was, and then he left. Aaliyah had expected him to stay. She wasn't sure whether she was relieved or unsettled that he didn't. She called Owen Price from the kitchen while Nyla was asleep. Owen answered on the 4th ring, sounding like a man who had been waiting for this call and was slightly terrified it had finally come. You okay? He said. Getting there, she said. Owen, I need to know something, and I need you to be honest. Okay. If this goes somewhere official, if I actually do this, would you testify about what you saw? The silence on the other end was long enough that she could hear him breathing. Yes, he said finally. Yeah. I would, even if it cost you the job. That job is already on borrowed time for me, he said. I can't keep pretending I didn't see what I saw. He stopped. You signed that statement. You didn't have a choice. But I didn't sign anything. I just kept my mouth shut because I was scared. That's on me. Oh, no, it is. It's on me. His voice was tight. Tell me what you need, she told him. The first week in the house outside the city passed with a strange suspended quality, as though the world Aaliyah had been living in had been paused, and she was standing in the pause trying to remember how to breathe normally. Nyla baked. That was what Nyla did. She worked through the kitchen systematically, attempting things she'd watched on videos and adjusting them according to her own theories about sugar ratios, and the house filled with smells that were so far from the antiseptic sting of burn ointment and restaurant kitchen, and the particular industrial cleanness of Sterling House, that Aaliyah sometimes stood in the doorway of the kitchen just to be inside the smell of it. Junho came every other day. He never stayed long. He came in the late morning, after Nyla had eaten breakfast, and before her afternoon project consumed the kitchen. He brought things, not gifts, nothing that felt like the particular transaction of a man trying to make a woman feel obligated, but practical things. A specific antibiotic cream Dr. Sung had recommended that wasn't available at the local pharmacy. A new set of measuring cups because Nyla had identified a gap in the kitchen's equipment. A folder of documents she needed to understand. That was when Aaliyah started to understand the scope of what Junho had been building. The folder contained Victor Wexler's corporate structure going back 15 years. Subsidiary companies, shell entities, property management arms, hospitality holdings. Within those documents were patterns that an accountant or a federal investigator would recognize immediately, payments that moved in the wrong direction, contracts that were backdated, employee settlements that were structured to include confidentiality provisions that were themselves potentially illegal. You've been building this for 20 years, she said. Not a question. Yes. And you never used it. He sat across from her at the kitchen table while Nyla's radio played something bright and slightly off-key from the back bedroom. I always wanted to use it the right way. The way that meant it would actually hold. Victor has very good lawyers. If you go at him with anything less than overwhelming and airtight, he survives. Everyone who testified pays for it. And my case changes that? Your case is the human face, he said. All of that, he nodded at the folder, is financial and structural. What Victor's lawyers have always been able to do is make that abstract. Numbers, technicalities, corporate procedure. You stand up in front of a federal investigation and describe what Graham did to you and what Victor did afterward, and it stops being abstract. Aaliyah looked at the folder. Graham, she said, what happens to him in this? He's exposed as someone who committed aggravated assault and then participated in a cover-up, orchestrated by his father. Depending on how the federal investigation develops, Potentially conspiracy charges. Victor will protect him. Victor will try. Junho's jaw tightened slightly. Graham is his liability now. Victor may or may not recognize that yet. Have you met Graham? She said. In person? Once. 3 years ago. At an event he paused. He's the kind of man who's never been told no by anyone with actual power over him. Those men have a particular quality. I know the quality, Aaliyah said flatly. There was a beat of silence. I know you do, Junho said. Close the folder. She pressed her bandaged right hand flat on the cover, feeling the pressure, testing the sensation. Fingers were moving better. Dr. Sung said the tendon damage was less severe than the worst case scenario, which meant she was cautiously optimistic, which in Dr. Sung's vocabulary meant she thought Aaliyah would probably have full use of the hand back if she didn't do anything stupid. You said your mother was discarded, Aaliyah said, when she got sick. Yes. What was her name? He looked at her. Something crossed his face, not pain exactly, but the expression of someone whose most protected thing has been touched carefully enough that they aren't sure whether to allow it. Ji-yeon, he said. Kang Ji-yeon. What was she like? The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of someone finding the true version of a person they've been carrying as an abstraction. For so long, the human details had gone soft. Practical, he said finally. She didn't waste anything. She didn't complain about things she couldn't change. She saved money in a tin behind the stove because she didn't trust banks. She'd had money dissipate Korea. And she didn't trust the American system yet either. He paused. She made soup that took all day. She said anything worth eating was worth waiting for. Aaliyah nodded slowly. She sounds like someone I would have liked, she said. Junho picked up his coffee. He looked at the table. She would have liked you, he said. She had no patience for people who folded. She respected people who stayed on their feet. From the back of the house, Nyla's music changed to something louder and more insistent. A moment later, there was a small crash, and Nyla's voice announced from a distance, with remarkable composure, that everything was fine, and she had it under control. Junho's mouth moved. Almost a smile. Almost. The moment was interrupted by his phone. He looked at it, and whatever was on the screen rearranged his face immediately into something colder and more closed. I have to make a call, he said. He went outside. Aaliyah watched him through the kitchen window. He stood on the porch with the phone pressed to his ear, and the quality of his stillness was different from the version she'd been watching over the past week. This was not the calm of a man who was at rest. This was the stillness of a predator who had just received information. Came back in 4 minutes later. His expression gave her nothing. Victor knows you're gone from the apartment, he said. He was going to find out. He also knows that the 96-hour documentation window passed without your response, which means he's now treating the lease as forfeit. He set the phone on the table. And my people have picked up communication, suggesting he's looking for you. Aaliyah felt the cold move through her stomach. Specifically looking, his people making inquiries. Nothing direct yet. But Victor is not a patient man when he's frightened, and he is currently frightened. Junho's voice was level, factual. The way someone talks when they are reporting information and deliberately not forming the emotional response it would be reasonable to have. He's found out who you talked to outside Sterling House that night. Or rather, who you got into a car with. The cold moved deeper. He knows it was you, she said. Yes. She stood up from the table, walked to the kitchen window, stood there looking at the backyard, at the old trees, and the gray November light coming through them, at the place where the property ended in a line of shrubs, and the road wasn't visible. Victor Wexler is scared of you, she said. Yes. And a scared Victor Wexler is going to do what, exactly? Junho's answer was steady. He's going to try to make you disappear before you can become a problem that's bigger than he can manage. Not violently. That's not his method directly. He'll apply pressure through intermediaries. Legal threats. Financial pressure. Possibly through someone in your life who's still reachable, your neighbor. Someone at Nyla's school. Someone whose cooperation he can compel through other means. Aaliyah's hands tightened on the windowsill. Mrs. Delgado, she said. Probably not, but possibly anyone whose name is attached to a Wexler property. His reach in New York real estate is significant. She turned from the window. I want to talk to your investigators, she said. The ones with the corporate records. I want to understand the whole picture. before I talk to anyone federal. I want to know what I'm walking into." "That can be arranged," he said. "And I want Dennis Corbett," she said. "The restaurant manager. I know he's been carrying this. He was in that room. He knew what happened, and he said nothing, and he signed off on whatever Victor told him to sign off on. But he's not Victor. He's a man who made a terrible decision because he was scared, and now he's been living inside it for 3 weeks." She paused. "People like that can be reached if someone approaches them the right way." Junho studied her. "You think you can get to him," he said. "I think I understand what's inside his head better than your investigators do," she said. "I worked for that man for 3 years. I know what he sounds like when he's ashamed of something." Something shifted in Junho's assessment of her. She could see it happen. Not dramatically, not with any of the performance of a man revising his opinion in real time, but in the quality of attention he was giving her. A slight recalibration. "What approach would you use?" he said. "I'd tell him I'm not trying to destroy him," she said. I'd tell him I know he didn't start this, is whether he's found when the whole thing collapses standing on Victor's side or on the side that was telling the truth. Because it is going to collapse. He needs to understand that part is not optional. And if he calls Victor immediately afterward, then we know he's beyond reaching," she said. "But I don't think he will. Dennis Corbett is a man who is very bad at living with things." Junho thought about this. "Not yet," he said. "Not until we've done more groundwork. If Victor knows you've made contact with Corbett, it speeds up his timeline." She didn't like it, but she nodded. "Dr. Crow," she said then. "The physician who falsified my report. We're already working on him." "How? He has a license," Junho said. "He has a career. He has, as of 3 days ago, been made quietly aware that the document he signed is being looked at by people who are not Victor Wexler's lawyers." He paused. "He's not sleeping well." Aaliyah absorbed that. "And Graham?" she said. A long pause. "Graham is aware that something is moving," Junho said carefully. "Victor will have told him. Whether Victor has told him the full extent of what's moving, I don't know." "What does Graham do when he's scared?" Junho's answer came slowly. "He does what his father tells him to." "And what is his father telling him to do?" The silence lasted longer this time. Before Junho could answer, his phone went again. He looked at it. Whatever it said, he was on his feet, before Aaliyah finished reading his expression. "Stay here," he said. "What?" "One of my people picked up movement near your old apartment building," he said. His voice was completely flat now, all the texture gone out of it. "Victor's people, going through what's left in your unit." Aaliyah felt something cold and specific move through her. "He's looking for something I left behind," she said. "What would he find?" She thought fast. She had packed what mattered. She had the photograph that was in her wallet, which was on her person. She had her phone. But she'd left the lease documentation in the kitchen drawer. She'd left Nyla's school enrollment forms. She'd left a notebook. She used to track her shifts and her tips with dates and amounts going back 14 months. And she had left, tucked inside a birthday card from Mrs. Delgado at the back of her top dresser drawer, a handwritten note from Owen Price that she'd forgotten. Was there 3 lines scrawled on a napkin, dated the morning after the incident. That said, "I saw what happened. It wasn't your fault. I have a picture if you ever need it." If Victor's people found that note, Owen was exposed. And if Owen was exposed before he could formally testify, Victor would come for him the same way he'd come for her. She was already moving toward the bedroom for her phone. "I have to call Owen," she said. "Aaliyah, if they find what's in that drawer, he's in danger," she said. She was dialing already. "He's 23 years old, and he stuck his neck out for me, and I left his name in a drawer in that apartment, and I need to tell him right now to my—" The call connected. Owen's phone rang once, twice, 3 times, 4. Voicemail. She pulled the phone away from her ear and looked at it. Junho was watching her from the doorway. With the expression of a man who understood exactly what the unanswered phone meant and was calculating the implications faster than she could follow. "Where does Owen live?" he said. "Queens," she said. "Astoria. I don't know the exact building." He mentioned a Greek place on the corner. Blue awning. Junho was already on his own phone. Aaliyah stood in the middle of the bedroom. Holding her, stood with Owen's voicemail still playing in her ear, and listened to Junho give clipped, specific instructions to whoever was on the other end, and felt the full weight of what she had set in motion come down on her at once. She had thought she was making a careful decision. She had thought she was taking her time, thinking it through, not making any move until she understood the board. She hadn't understood the board. Victor had already been moving while she was thinking. She had left Owen exposed for 3 weeks by staying quiet, and then she had left his name in a dresser drawer by failing to check everything when she packed, and now Victor's people were in her apartment. And Owen wasn't answering his phone, and every calculation she had made about being careful and protecting the people around her had just proven itself wrong in the specific, irrevocable way that things prove themselves wrong when the time for being careful has already passed. Junho ended his call. He turned to her. "My people are 20 minutes from his neighborhood," he said, "and if Victor's people get there first." Junho didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Outside the window, the November light had gone flat and gray, and the trees at the edge of the property stood absolutely still in the cold. And somewhere in Astoria, a 23-year-old kid who had taken a blurry photograph because it was the right thing to do was not answering his phone. Aaliyah made the decision in the space between one breath and the next. She was not waiting in this house, while other people managed the consequences of a fight she had started. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the bedroom door. "I'm coming with you," she said. Junho looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he said, "Get Nyla ready." They found Owen Price sitting on the front steps of his building in Astoria with his hands between his knees and his phone face down on the concrete beside him. He was alive. That was the first thing Aaliyah registered when the car came around the corner and the headlights caught him, the specific, unmistakable posture of a person who has just been through something and is now on the other side of it, processing in the particular stillness that follows a sharp shock. He was not hurt. He was not being detained. He was sitting on cold concrete at 9:40 at night looking at nothing, and when Junho's car pulled up, he looked at it with the expression of a man who had already decided that whatever came next, he was done pretending. Aaliyah was out of the car before it fully stopped. "Owen." He looked up at her. His eyes were red at the edges. Not crying. Owen didn't strike her as someone who cried easily, but the red of someone who had been holding his face a specific way for too long. "They came to the restaurant," he said. She stopped. "What?" "2 men this afternoon. Before the dinner service." He picked up his phone, turned it over, looked at it like it was evidence. "They said they were from Victor's legal team. They said they wanted to discuss my account of the kitchen incident. They had the date, they had the exact date, and whether I had any interest in clarifying my recollection of events." Aaliyah felt Junho come up beside her. She didn't look at him. "What did you say?" she said. "I said I didn't know what they were talking about." Owen's jaw tightened, which was a lie, and they knew it was a lie, and I knew they knew. And we all just stood there in the Sterling House parking structure with that lie sitting between us, and one of them said. He stopped, breathed. He said that memory is a fragile thing, and that it was in everyone's interest that I take some time to think carefully about what I actually remembered versus what I might have convinced myself I remembered. The specific architecture of that threat, polished, deniable, constructed to leave no fingerprints, was so recognizably Victor Wexler's that Aaliyah felt it in her stomach. "They went to your apartment afterward," Junho said. It wasn't a question. Owen looked at him for the first time. Taking him in, calibrating. "Yeah. I came home and found the super in the hallway looking guilty. Said someone from a property management company had come asking about the building's maintenance records. But 2 of my dresser drawers were open." He paused. "I don't leave dresser drawers open." "Did they find anything?" Junho said. "I don't keep anything at home worth finding," Owen said. Then to Aaliyah, "The picture I sent you. That's the only copy. I don't have a backup. I deleted it off my phone the night I took it because I was scared, and I thought," he stopped. "I thought if I didn't have it, they couldn't use it against me. I wasn't thinking about using it against them." "You were 23 years old and you were scared," Aaliyah said. "You sent me what you had, which is nothing if your phone gets taken." "My phone won't get taken," she said. Owen looked at her arm, at the bandaging, at the way she was holding it. Something moved across his face, guilt, and the specific kind of guilt that belongs to people who watched something happen and did the minimum rather than the necessary. "I should have done more," he said. "The night it happened. I had a picture. I had my own 2 eyes. I could have lost everything and accomplished nothing," Aaliyah said. "Victor would have buried it. You know that. Maybe, he said. But maybe it would have mattered anyway. Junho spoke from beside her, quietly. It matters now, if you're still willing. Owen looked at him again. The assessment going on behind his eyes was visible this time. He was deciding how much to trust a man he didn't know, with a face that was impossible to fully read, standing on an Astoria sidewalk at night with two other men behind him who had appeared from nowhere, and were currently saying nothing. "Who are you?" Owen said. "Someone who wants Victor Wexler to answer for what he's built," Junho said. "The same as her." "That's not an answer," no, Junho said. "It's not. But it's what I have for you right now, and you can decide whether it's enough." Owen sat with that for a moment. Then he stood up from the steps, picked up his phone, and pushed it into his jacket pocket. "What do you need from me?" he said. They drove back to the house outside the city, with Owen in the back seat beside Aaliyah, and Nyla asleep against Aaliyah's shoulder, having exactly 40 minutes into the drive, before exhaustion took her down. Owen spent the first 20 minutes of the drive staring out the window. Then he turned and spoke quietly so the sleeping child wouldn't stir. "They're going to come back," he said. "Victor's people. They came once to feel me out. When I didn't respond the way they wanted, they'll come again with something harder." "I know," Junho said from the front. "Harder meaning what, exactly?" Aaliyah said. "Meaning they'll find something," Owen said. "Or they'll make something. My work visa renewal is in 2 months. My grandmother is in a Wexler-adjacent assisted living facility in Queens. Not Wexler directly, but the management company that runs it has Wexler properties in its ownership structure." He said it with a flat precision of someone spent the evening thinking through every point of vulnerability in his life. "I looked it up tonight, after they left. I went home, found my drawers open, and spent 3 hours researching every building, company, and institution in my life to see how far his reach went." Aaliyah looked at him. "How far did it go?" Owen let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but wasn't. "Far enough." The house was cold when they arrived. They'd left in a hurry, and the heat had been turned down. Junho got it running, while Aaliyah carried Nyla to bed. Owen stood in the kitchen with his jacket still on, and his arms crossed over his chest, not moving, just existing in the space with the careful stillness of someone who is trying not to take up too much room. When Aaliyah came back out, he was looking at the folder on the kitchen table, the one with Victor's corporate structure. "Can I?" he said. She nodded. He opened it and started reading. He read the way people read when they're not performing, reading quickly, going back, stopping at specific pages. After 10 minutes, he looked up. "He owns 17 properties within a 6-block radius of Sterling House," he said. "Yes. And the restaurant's ownership structure is..." He turned a page. 3 holding companies, 2 of which share directors, with the property management company that controls your old building. "Yes. This is a pattern," Owen said. "This isn't one bad decision. This is a system." "That's what Junho's been building the case around," Aaliyah said. Owen looked at Junho, who was leaning against the counter with his coffee, watching this exchange with the expression of a man who was content to let it develop at its own pace. "And the federal angle," Owen said. "How close is that?" "Close enough that Victor is scared," Junho said. "Not close enough yet that it moves without Aaliyah's testimony." Owen set the folder down. He looked at Aaliyah. "Then we need to move faster than we're moving," he said. 3 days passed. They were not quiet days, even though on the surface the house looked quiet. Owen made calls from a phone Junho provided, not his own phone, not his regular number to 2 former Sterling House employees, who had left in the past year under circumstances that he described carefully as not entirely their choice. One of those calls lasted 40 minutes. The other lasted nearly 2 hours. Aaliyah could hear Owen's voice from the kitchen. Not the words, but the quality of it, patient, steady. The voice of someone who was telling the truth and knew how to let that do most of the work. Junho's investigators made contact with Dennis Corbett. Corbett did not respond well. Junho relayed this to Aaliyah in the kitchen on the morning of the 3rd day, and his face when he told her was careful in the specific way of someone delivering a result that was worse than expected. He called Victor's lawyers, he said. The words landed in her chest. "Within how long?" she said. 20 minutes of my investigator leaving his presence. Aaliyah sat down. She pressed her good hand flat on the table. "He panicked," she said. "Yes." "Which means Victor now knows we've approached him." "Yes." which means Victor knows we're close enough to be building something. Yes. Junho sat across from her, which accelerates his timeline. The timeline accelerated faster than either of them expected. The call came at 11 that night. It was not Junho's phone. It was Aaliyah's her own number, the one she had kept, because changing it would mean losing contact with Nyla's busy school, with Mrs. Delgado, with every person in her life who might need to reach her. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, she answered. Ms. Monroe. The voice was male, mid-range, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who made many calls and kept none of them personal. I'm calling on behalf of Victor Wexler. Mr. Wexler would like to express his genuine concern for your well-being and his hope that you are recovering comfortably. Aaliyah said nothing. Mr. Wexler is also aware that you may have been in contact with certain individuals who have presented you with a skewed picture of the situation and encouraged you toward actions that would not ultimately be in your best interest. A pause. Or in the best interest of your daughter. The word daughter landed like something physical. I'm going to need you to be specific, Aaliyah said. Of course, Mr. Wexler is prepared to offer a resolution that would include. I said specific, she said. About my daughter. A beat of silence. Ms. Monroe, Mr. Wexler simply wants to ensure that all parties can move forward in a way that is stable and secure for everyone involved. Children need stability. He understands that. He wants to make sure that. She ended the call. Her hand was shaking. She pressed it against her thigh and breathed through her nose and looked it through her nose and looked at the wall across from where she was sitting. He had said the word daughter, not incidentally, not as context, as a marker, as the specific thing he wanted her to understand he was willing to touch. Junho appeared in the doorway. He had heard her voice, the short, clipped exchange, and he stood in the doorway now reading her face with the same quality of attention that she had first noticed at table 3 in Sterling House. Victor, she said. It wasn't a question. Junho came into the room. He sat across from her. He mentioned Nyla, she said. Something shifted behind Junho's eyes. Not dramatically, a deepening. What exactly did he say, she told him. Word for word. She had the kind of memory that came from years of taking orders without writing them down, and she replayed it cleanly. Junho was quiet for a long moment. He's not going to touch her, he said. You don't know. He won't, Junho said, and the quality of certainty in his voice was not comfort, it was operational. Victor uses children as leverage. He doesn't harm them. Harming a 6-year-old creates a kind of exposure he cannot manage. He knows that. And you're certain of that, Aaliyah said. Her voice was flat. I'm certain that Victor Wexler is a calculating man, and harming a child would be the single worst calculation he could make. He held her gaze. I'm not certain of anything else. That honesty, stark and undecorated, was the thing that made her breathe again. She found Owen in the kitchen at 7 the next morning, earlier than she expected. He was on his second coffee, and he looked like he hadn't slept. Called me, he said. My grandmother. Aaliyah stopped. Last night, he said. Her facility called first, said there was a paperwork issue with her insurance coverage. Then she called me, crying, saying someone had told her that her housing situation might be in jeopardy. He looked at his coffee cup. She's 81 years old. She has nowhere else to go. He set the cup down with the careful deliberateness of someone managing an emotion by controlling their hands. Victor's people contacted the management company. That's what happened. I can't prove it, but I know that's what happened. Aaliyah sat down across from him. Owen, don't tell me it's okay, he said. It's not okay. She doesn't know what any of this is about. She just knows she might lose her room, and she called me crying at 9 at night, and I couldn't tell her why it was happening because I couldn't do that to her. He stopped. His jaw worked. Victor Wexler reached into my family and grabbed hold of an 81-year-old woman because she was the most convenient handle he could find. That's what kind of man he is. The room was quiet. Are you still in? Aaliyah said. Owen looked at her. Yeah, he said, more than before. It was Junho's investigator, a compact, efficient woman named Sung Mi, who operated with the low-profile precision of someone who had spent years finding things that other people thought they had successfully hidden, who delivered the information that broke the plan apart. She came to the house on the 5th day. She sat at the kitchen table with a tablet and her own printed documents and a face that gave away exactly nothing, and she laid out what she had found in the careful sequential manner of someone who understood that the order of information mattered as much as the information itself. Dennis Corbett had not simply called Victor's lawyers. He had been calling them for 11 days before Junho's investigator ever made contact. Sungmi placed a printed phone record on the table. The calls were there in black ink. Corbett's number, a number registered to a legal entity, 3 corporate layers above Victor's public companies, 8 calls in 11 days, the shortest lasting 4 minutes and the longest lasting 41. Aaliyah looked at the dates. The first call was 2 days after she'd last spoken to Corbett at Sterling House. He wasn't waiting to be contacted, she said. No, Sungmi said. He went to them. Yes. Aaliyah picked up the record and looked at it, and then set it back down. He told them I was building something, she said. We believe so, Sungmi said, based on the timing of Victor's subsequent actions. The property management inquiry into your lease, the approach to Owen, the contact with Mr. Price's grandmother's facility. The sequence suggests Corbett provided Victor with information about your situation earlier than we accounted for. Aaliyah felt the shape of it settle over her. How early, she said. Sungmi looked at her. Something in the investigator's face went very carefully neutral. The first call was placed on the morning after you told Owen you were planning to fight this, she said. The kitchen went absolutely silent. Aaliyah thought about the night she'd called Owen from the house. She thought about the conversation telling him she was going to go forward, asking if he would testify, hearing him say yes. She thought about the relief of that conversation. She thought about who else might have been listening. My phone, she said. We think so, Sungmi said. Someone. We can't confirm who appears to have flagged your number for monitoring. It wouldn't have been difficult, given Victor's resources and his connections in the city's telecommunications infrastructure. Junho's voice came from across the table. When? When was the monitoring initiated? Sungmi checked her notes. Based on the timeline, we believe it began within 48 hours of the incident at Sterling House. The timeline played back in Aaliyah's head. 48 hours after the incident. That was before she'd signed the statement. Before Victor had even come to the break room. He had started monitoring her communications before he'd even known whether she was going to be a problem. Because for Victor Wexler, anyone with information about his operation was a problem by default. Every call she'd made from her phone. The call to Owen. Call to Mrs. Delgado the night she'd gone with Junho. Every text. He knew about Junho, she said. Yes, Junho said. He knew from the first night, and he didn't move immediately because he was watching where it led, Junho said. He wanted to know the full scope. He wanted to see everyone involved before he moved on any of them. Aaliyah pressed her good hand flat on the table. She felt the grain of the wood under her palm. She concentrated on it. Corbett knew I was going to fight this from the beginning, she said, and he told Victor. Which means every step I've been telling myself was careful every decision. I thought I was making from a position of some control. Victor already knew about it. Nobody contradicted this. The photograph in her wallet felt suddenly very small. She had been building a case around evidence she controlled. She had been moving with the belief that the element of surprise, at least in part, was on her side. She had been telling herself that she was being strategic. Victor had been reading her strategy since the 3rd day. Owen spoke from across the table. He also knows about this house. The sentence fell like something dropped from height. Junho looked at him. How do you know that? Junho said. Because if he had access to her phone calls from the beginning, he knows she left her apartment with you, Owenson said. And if he knows you're involved, he has resources to find out what properties connect to your organization. It might take time, but we've been here almost a week. He paused. If I were Victor, I'd know about this house by now. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Junho took out his phone. He didn't speak immediately. He was running something through his head. Aaliyah could see it, the rapid internal calculation of a man reassessing a board that has just changed configuration. Then he made a call. He spoke in Korean. Aaliyah caught nothing of it except the pace fast, clipped, moving from one point to the next without pause. When he ended the call, 30 seconds had passed. We're moving, he said. Tonight. To where? Aaliyah said. Somewhere that doesn't connect to me through any visible chain. He was already moving toward the hallway. I need 20 minutes to arrange it. Junho. She said his name the way she would have said, stop. He stopped. She looked at him from across the kitchen. What else? He came back. He sat down. He put both hands flat on the table, the closest she had ever seen him come to a gesture of complete honesty, and he looked at her with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been holding something back and has just decided the cost of holding it is higher than the cost of release. Corbett told Victor something else, he said. In the most recent call, 4 days ago. What? Junho looked at the table for a moment, then at her. He told Victor that you have the photograph, he said. That Owen took a picture the night of the incident. That it shows Graham's arm in motion. That you've been carrying it. The air went out of Aaliyah's lungs. He knew about the photograph, she said. Corbett was in the kitchen that night, Owen said. His voice had gone hollow. He was walked through when I was showing it to you. He would have seen. I didn't think he was paying attention. He was paying attention, Junho said. Aaliyah's right hand moved instinctively to her jacket pocket, to where her wallet was. She could feel the square edge of it through the fabric. If Victor knows about the photograph, she said. Her voice was very steady, which was a thing that happened to her when the fear went too high. The voice went flat and functional while everything else went white. Then his lawyers know about it, which means they're already building a case for why it's inadmissible or manufactured, or why Owen's credibility is compromised. Yes, Junho said. And Dr. Crow, she said. If Victor knows we've been pressuring Crow, he's already gotten to Crow. Offered him something we can't match. Junho's jaw worked. We made contact with Crow this morning, he said. And a pause. He's recanted, Junho said. He's issued a statement through Victor's legal team saying that the original incident report was accurate and that any suggestion that the documentation was falsified is a misrepresentation of his professional assessment. The statement was so carefully constructed, so obviously written by a lawyer and rubber-stamped by a frightened physician, that hearing it described out loud made something rise in Aaliyah's chest that was not grief and was not fury, but was the first cousin of both. She had the photograph. She had Owen. She had a file of corporate records that Victor's lawyers would spend 18 months burying in motions and counter-documentation. She had a physician who had just publicly reversed his position under legal cover. She had a restaurant manager who had been feeding her movements to the enemy from the start. And she had a daughter upstairs who was asleep in a house that Victor Wexler might already know the address of. I need to think, she said. We have 20 minutes, Junho said. I know, she said. I need 20 minutes. She went upstairs. She stood in the doorway of the room where Nyla was sleeping. The small room with the wood splitting and the lamp with the blue shade that Nyla had insisted on leaving on because she didn't like waking up in the dark in a new place. The cookie dough jar was on the nightstand. There was flour on the floor from yesterday's project that Aaliyah hadn't fully swept up yet. Nyla's face in sleep had the complete absence of performance that children's faces have when no one is watching. Just a small person existing without armor, breathing slowly, entirely trusting that the world around her was being managed by someone competent. Aaliyah stood in the doorway and let herself feel for exactly 60 seconds every single thing she had been compressing since the night the broth came down. The pain, the fear, the humiliation of signing a false statement in a break room while her arm burned. The cold mathematics of watching powerful people build traps around her while she tried to be careful. The specific, nauseating feeling of realizing that her carefulness had not been protection. It had been data that the enemy collected while she believed she was acting in secret. She let all of it come up, and then she breathed. And then she put it back down. Not because it didn't matter, but because it was not useful right now. She went back downstairs. Owen was at the table, with the corporate file open again. Junho was on the phone in the hallway. Sungmi was closing her tablet, preparing to leave. Aaliyah sat down. She took her wallet out of her jacket pocket. She opened it. She looked at Owen's photograph. Blurry, imperfect angle, Graham's arm extended. Her face in the half-second before the pain registered. She set it on the table. Everything we've built around this, she said. The physician, the manager, the corporate records as secondary support. Victor has moved on all of it. He's been moving since day 3. She looked at Owen, which means the photograph and your direct testimony are essentially what we have left. Owen looked at the photograph. That's enough if we go directly to federal investigators, he said. Victor will bury the photograph, Aaliyah said. His lawyers will argue chain of custody, image manipulation, anything they can find. We need corroborating testimony, and Crow just walked back the medical report, which means we need someone who wasn't already compromised, Owen said. Someone Victor hasn't gotten to yet, Aaliyah thought. The other Sterling House staff, who were in that room the night it happened, she said. Victor's lawyers would have approached the senior staff immediately. But the junior staff, the runners, the secondary kitchen crew, there were 3 or 4 people present who weren't directly in the chain of command. Who Victor might have assumed were too peripheral to matter. Owen sat up straighter. Marcus, he said. Who? Marcus Webb. He was a food runner that night. He was maybe 12 feet away when it happened. He quit Sterling House 2 months later, said the environment was toxic. Owen's voice was picking up pace. Victor's people went after management, went after the medical record, went after me. But Marcus wasn't staff management, and he wasn't a witness they'd have flagged unless they'd done a very complete inventory of everyone present. He paused. Do you know if they did a complete inventory? Junho appeared in the doorway. He had heard. We can find out, he said. How fast? Aaliyah said. By morning, Junho said. Then find out, she said. And in the meantime, we need to move, because this house is compromised. And Nyla is upstairs, and I'm done making decisions from a position of not understanding the board. She picked up the photograph. She put it back in her wallet. She looked at both of them in turn. We don't hide anymore, she said. We stop waiting for Victor to move, and we start moving ourselves. We find Marcus Webb. We get his account documented and filed before Victor's people get to him. And then we take everything we have, the photograph, Owen's testimony, Marcus, if we can get him, the corporate records directly to the federal investigators. She paused. No more intermediaries. No more building the case quietly in the background, while Victor reads every step over our shoulders. We go directly. Owen looked at Junho. Junho looked at Aaliyah. If we go directly and it's not enough, Junho started. If we keep waiting for it to be enough, Victor will dismantle every piece we have, Aaliyah said. He's already started. Crow is gone. Corbett is compromised. The house is probably burned. She held Junho's gaze. So we go with what we have, and we go now. Because waiting has cost us everything that we built in the last week, and going is the one thing we haven't tried yet. Junho was quiet. Then he nodded. It was a small thing. A single motion. But it meant everything was different now. Above them, in the white-curtained room, with the blue lamp and the flower on the floor, Nyla slept on without knowing that the world her mother had been carefully constructing around her had just been torn down and rebuilt from scratch in the space of 1 hour. She turned over in her sleep. The cookie dough jar caught the lamplight. Downstairs, Aaliyah Monroe put on her coat, picked up her bag, and went to wake her daughter for the second time in a week, because staying still had stopped being safe. But this time she was not running. She had stopped running completely. She was moving forward, and she was moving toward something. And the thing she was moving toward had Victor Wexler's name on it. They moved Nyla at 2 in the morning. She woke without complaint, which was the thing about Nyla that periodically broke Aaliyah's heart. The child had developed the specific adaptability of someone who had learned early that when her mother said it was time to go, it was time to go, and asking why only used up minutes they didn't have. She put on her shoes. She carried her own bag. She held the cookie dough jar against her chest like a small athlete carrying a trophy and walked out to the car with her eyes still half closed and her hair pushed sideways from the pillow. Aaliyah buckled her in. Nyla was asleep again before they cleared the driveway. The new location was a third-floor apartment in a building in the Bronx that connected to no name Aaliyah recognized and no property record that Sung Mai believed Victor's people had mapped. Fair Place 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, with a table, windows that looked out over a street that stayed busy until 4 in the morning and then went quiet. Junho had used it before for situations that required discretion, and its walls held the particular neutral emptiness of a space that had absorbed many difficult things and retained the memory of none of them. Aaliyah put Nyla down in the smaller bedroom. She stood in the kitchen with Owen and Junho and Sung Mi and the specific electric quality of 4 people who have just acknowledged that the cautious version of the plan is over. Marcus Webb, Junho said. He had his phone on the table. Sung Mai located him this afternoon. He's in the Bronx, actually. Works at a catering company in Mott Haven. He left Sterling House in January and has had no contact with Victor Wexler's operation since. Has Victor's team approached him? Aaliyah said. Not that we can confirm, which could mean they haven't gotten to him yet, or it could mean they approached him quietly enough that we wouldn't see it. Sung's voice was precise, as it always was. I'm inclined to believe he hasn't been approached. Victor's people were systematic, and the approach order suggests they went after management first, then witnesses in the chain of command. A food runner who left 7 months ago would be lower priority. For now, Owen said. For now, Sungmi agreed. Junho looked at Aaliyah. You want to approach him yourself. It wasn't a question. He had learned, over the weeks, to read when she had made a decision by the quality of stillness that followed it. He's not going to trust a lawyer, she said. He's not going to trust your investigators. No offense. He's going to trust someone who was there, someone who knows what that room smelled like and what it sounded like when the broth hit and what it felt like to go back to work afterward, because the rent was due. She paused. That's me. Nobody else in this room can walk up to Marcus Webb and have that conversation. No one argued. They reached Marcus Webb at 7:30 in the morning outside his catering company. Before his shift started, Sung-mi had determined which Sung-min was most likely to be alone and most likely to be reachable without the kind of performance that people put on in front of coworkers. He was 26, compact, careful moving with the expression of a man who had been surprised before and had decided to preemptively neutralize his own reactions to things. Sons. He saw Aaliyah coming, and his face did something she recognized. It went briefly through the door that stood between remembering something and deciding whether to acknowledge it, and then it came out on the side of acknowledgement. You were at Sterling House, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at Owen beside her, then at the car idling down the block where Junho was waiting. What is this, he said. A conversation, Aaliyah said. I'm not going to pretend it's something else. I want to talk to you about the night of the Wexler party, what you saw, and I want to know whether you'd be willing to make a formal statement. Marcus looked at her bandaged arm, then at her face. My grandmother used to say, you can tell when someone's already paid for what they're asking, he said. I've paid, she said. He stood there for a moment with his jacket half unzipped and the morning cold coming off the street, and whatever calculation he was running, moving through his face at a pace she could almost follow. I saw what happened, he said. I know. The whole thing. I was right there. His jaw tightened. And then management came around the next day and told us it was an accident, and that discussing it with anyone outside the restaurant was grounds for immediate dismissal. He looked at the sidewalk. I had rent. I kept my mouth shut. And then I got out of there as fast as I could because I couldn't keep going in there every day and looking at that dining room. Would you testify to what you saw? Aaliyah said. What happens to me if I do? I'm not going to lie to you about that, she said. Victor Wexler will find out. His people will come at you. They'll look for leverage, your housing, your family, anything they can find. She held his gaze. But you'd be going in formally, on the record, with documentation and legal protection that comes with federal involvement. That's different from just talking. Federal. He said the word carefully. Yes. Marcus looked at Owen. You're in all the way, Owen said. Marcus looked at the idling car down the block. Who's in the car? Someone who's been building a case against Victor Wexler for 20 years, Aaliyah said. And who needs what you saw to make it stick? Marcus Webb was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said, when do you need the statement? Today, Aaliyah said. He blinked. Today. If we wait, he gets to you, she said. I've watched him work. He moves on timelines we don't see until after. Today is the only day I can promise. He hasn't already moved. Marcus looked at the door of the catering company behind him. At the shift he was about to start. At the ordinary Tuesday that was dissolving in front of him. Let me make a call, he said. He made two. The second one was to call out of his shift, and the quality of the lie he told was the kind that people tell when they've decided the thing they're lying about doesn't matter much anymore. He got in the car. Sungmi had a federal contact, a woman named Agent Claire Massey, DOJ, who had been building a parallel investigation into Wexler Properties' housing practices for 14 months and who had been waiting a sound green wood splitting with the particular patience of a federal investigator who understood that timing was everything for a human case that would give the financial documentation a face and a story that a grand jury could hold. Agreed to meet within 2 hours. They met in a federal office building in Lower Manhattan, in a conference room with fluorescent lights and a table that had been scuffed by years of exactly these kinds of conversations. Massey was 52, lean, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that moved over everything in a room with the automatic inventory of someone who had spent decades in spaces where details mattered. She shook Aaliyah's hand. She looked at the bandaged arm. She said nothing about it. They sat down. Aaliyah told her everything. She had told pieces of it before, to Junho, to Owen, in fragments and installments as trust developed and circumstances changed. This was different. This was the complete version, organized not by the order in which she had experienced it, but by the order in which it would be most useful to the woman across the table. She had thought about this in the car. She had arranged it. She told Massey about the harassment before the incident, about Graham's approach during the party, about the broth, the deliberateness of it, the angle of his arm, the way he said, "Watch where you're going," with the room full of witnesses who were already choosing not to witness it. She described the 21 days. She described Victor coming to the break room, the specific language he used, the way the threats about the apartment and the silence about her job were delivered in the same sentence without being connected explicitly. Because a man like Victor understood that explicit threats were the kind that could be quoted back in a courtroom. She placed Owen's photograph on the table. Massey looked at it for a long time without touching it. A sound like. Then she looked at Owen, who described what he had seen in the language of a person who had been composing this account in his head for months and knew exactly what he needed to say. Then Marcus Webb described what he had seen from 12 feet away in that private dining room, Graham's arm, the deliberate extension of it, the moment of contact with the pot, the silence that followed, and the way every face in that room had rearranged itself into the expression of people who had collectively decided they were somewhere else. Massey listened to all of it without interrupting. When Marcus finished, she looked at Junho, who was sitting at the end of the table with the corporate documentation. "Mr. Kang," she said, "I understand you have financial records pertaining to Wexler Properties' broader pattern of conduct." 20 years of it, Junho said. "I'll need to understand the provenance of those records. My legal team can walk you through that at whatever pace you require," he said. "The short version is that none of it was obtained illegally, and all of it will survive chain of custody scrutiny." He paused. "I've been waiting 20 years to hand this to someone who could use it. I didn't build it on a foundation that would fall apart at the first motion." Massey studied him. "You have a complicated relationship with legality, Mr. Kang," she said. "I have a complicated relationship with Victor Wexler," he said. "My relationship with this investigation will be uncomplicated." Another long pause. Massey stood up. "I need to make some calls," she said. "I need an hour. Is everyone willing to stay?" Everyone was willing to stay. The hour was the longest of Aaliyah's life. She spent most of it in the hallway outside the conference room, standing at a window that looked out over Lower Manhattan and the gray November sky pressing down on it. Owen sat on a bench against the wall with his phone in his hands, not using it. Marcus stood near the elevator, a man still processing the velocity at which his Tuesday had changed. Junho came to stand beside Aaliyah at the window. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the city. "She's going to say yes," Aaliyah said. "I think so," he said. "And then Victor finds out." "He'll find out quickly," Junho said. "Federal investigations are not invisible events, especially when someone in his network is watching for them. And he'll move on Graham." "Yes, what does Graham do?" she said. Junho was quiet for a moment. "In my experience, men like Graham do one of two things when they realize they're genuinely cornered," he said. "They try to run, or they try to make the problem disappear." Aaliyah turned to look at him. "He'll come for me." "He'll try," Junho said. "He'll go to his father first. Victor will tell him to wait. Graham will wait as long as he can, which in my assessment is not long." He paused. "When Graham decides his father's caution is moving too slowly, he'll act on his own. And you're going to let him," Aaliyah said. She said it not as an accusation, but as the articulation of something she had just understood. Junho looked at her. "I'm going to be ready for him," he said. "That's different." She held his gaze for a moment. "Nyla," she said. "Sungmi is with her right now," he said. "In the apartment. She doesn't leave. Not for any reason." Aaliyah nodded. She turned back to the window. "Your mother," she said. Jian. "When you found out what Victor had done, when you understood that it was his decision, his calculation, that put her in the ground. What did you want to do? Junho was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Everything that would have destroyed me in the process, he said, which is why I didn't. Discipline, she said. Patience, he said, which is discipline's less romantic name. Massey came back in 53 minutes. She sat down across from Aaliyah. We're opening a formal investigation, she said. Ms. Monroe, I need you to understand what that means practically. It means your testimony will be on the record. It means Victor Wexler's legal team will receive notification within 48 hours. It means you will need ongoing protection and ongoing legal representation, neither of which, she glanced at Junho, should come from sources that could complicate the credibility of your testimony. I'll retain my own attorney, Aaliyah said. Someone with no connection to anyone in this room. Massey nodded. There's one more thing. She set a photograph on the table. It was Graham Wexler, a recent photo, professional, the kind that appeared in corporate announcements. Within the last 4 hours, Massey said, we received intelligence from a separate channel suggesting that Graham Wexler has made contact with individuals previously associated with intimidation campaigns against witnesses in other Wexler-related civil actions. She spoke with the careful, specific cadence of someone choosing every word for its legal precision. We believe he is aware that a formal investigation is either imminent or in progress, and we believe he is not waiting for his father's direction. Aaliyah looked at Graham's photograph. The face in it was the same face that had looked at her across the pot of broth with that small, cold smile. He's going to the property, Aaliyah said. The first house. The one outside the city. We believe that's the most likely target, yes, Massey said. We believe his intelligence may be 48 to 72 hours out of date. Junho's expression didn't change. But something behind it did. Then we use that, he said. The plan that Junho built over the next 6 hours was not elegant. It was not the kind of plan that looked good on paper or that anyone would have designed from scratch, given unlimited options. It was the plan that the specific circumstances made possible, which meant it was built around what Graham believed was true rather than what was actually true, and it required Junho to go back to the first house, the one outside the city, the one that was compromised, and wait. Aaliyah argued against it, not the strategy. The specific part where Junho was the one waiting. Send someone else, she said. They were in a side room off the main corridor, while Owen and Marcus were being formally interviewed by Massey's team. You don't have to be physically present. Graham will have done his research, Junho said. He knows what I look like. He knows what my people look like. If he sends someone to scout the property and they see unfamiliar faces, he pulls back. He looked at her with the steady evenness that she had stopped finding infuriating and started finding, somewhere in the past 2 weeks, reliable. He needs to believe the house is still active. He needs to believe he's found us. And Nyla is in the Bronx with Sungmai. Graham doesn't know about the second location. Everything he has points to the first house. He paused. But I need you there too. She stared at him. I need to be with my daughter. I know. But if Graham's intelligence has your location at the first house and you're not there, his scouts will pick up the ups. He said it with the flatness of someone delivering a tactical reality he did not enjoy. You don't have to be inside. You need to be visible on the property, for long enough that anyone watching believes the house is still occupied. Then you leave before dark, before Graham's people move. Aaliyah sat with this. Every part of her wanted to refuse it. Every part of her that had been making tactical decisions since the night she'd decided to stop being afraid, understood that he was right. You'll have your people on the property, she said. Positioned before we arrive, he said. Graham walks into a situation that looks like opportunity. It isn't, and we get evidence connecting him to the attempt. Communications, vehicles, the people he sends. Everything documented and handed directly to Massey. He paused. I want him alive, and I want him in a federal building answering questions. That's the only version of this where Victor doesn't survive it. She looked at him. You could have destroyed Victor differently, she said, before any of this your own way. Yes, he said. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. Because destroying him my way would have made me the same kind of man, he said. And I've spent 20 years being careful not to become that. She held his gaze. Okay, she said. The drive back to the first house happened in the late afternoon, the November light already going thin and gray at the edges. Aaliyah sat in the passenger seat, with her good hand pressed flat on her thigh and her bandaged arm resting against her ribs, and her mind working through every contingency she could identify. The property looked different in the afternoon light. Smaller, somehow. The old trees had lost most of their leaves, and the ones that remained were the color of old rust, and the house sat behind them in the particular stillness of a place that knew what was coming. Junho's people were already there. Aaliyah couldn't see them. That was the point. But she knew they were in the tree line, at the road's edge, in positions that Junho had specified in a conversation conducted entirely in Korean that she had sat beside without understanding. She trusted the geometry of it. She went inside, made coffee she didn't drink, moved through the rooms with the casual, visible rhythm of someone going about their evening. A light on in the kitchen, a light on in the upstairs hallway, the television on low in the front room. She checked her phone. Sungmi's had sent a photograph. Nyla at the kitchen table in the Bronx apartment with flour on her nose and an expression of intense concentration directed at whatever she was making. The message below it said, "All quiet." She's showing me her technique. I have opinions, but I'm keeping them to myself. Something in Aaliyah's chest released a fraction. She typed back, "Tell her I'll be there by 10. Then she set the phone face down on the kitchen table and looked out the window at the trees in the failing light. She heard Junho's footsteps on the porch. He came in through the back door, which meant he had been out in the trees. He stood in the kitchen doorway, with leaves on his jacket, and his hands open at his sides, and his face carrying the specific stillness of a man who has just confirmed something he already believed. "They're here," he said. Her stomach tightened. "How many?" "2 vehicles on the approach road. Stopped about a quarter-mile out. Scouts first." He moved to the kitchen counter, keeping away from the windows. "Graham will be in one of the vehicles. He's not the kind of man who watches from a distance when he thinks he has the advantage." "He thinks he has the advantage," she said. "Yes." "Does he?" Junho looked at her. "No," he said. She nodded. "I need to leave," she said. "You said before dark." "Yes." "My car is at the back of the property, access road through the trees. My driver will take you to the Bronx." He reached into his jacket pocket and set a phone on the table. Not hers, a secondary, encrypted. "Massey's direct number is the first contact. If anything feels wrong before you reach Sungmi, you call her first." Aaliyah picked up the phone. She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the low light, with the television murmuring in the next room and the November dark pressing against the windows. "Come back," she said. It was the simplest thing she could have said. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. She went out through the back of the house. The tree line was 30 feet from the back door, and she walked it, without running, without looking behind her, because running and looking were things that people did when they were scared, and scared was not what she was. She was focused. There was a difference. The car was where Junho said it would be. The driver, a quiet man she recognized from the Bronx apartment, had the engine running and the heat on, and he pulled out onto the access road before she had fully closed the door. She did not look back at the house. She counted her breathing instead. In for 4, out for 4. The particular rhythm that kept the white noise from rising. Her phone, her own phone, not the encrypted one, buzzed. Unknown number. Her thumb hovered. She answered. Silence on the other end. Then a voice she recognized from a single conversation. A phone call conducted at 11 at night that had felt like a warning delivered in the language of concern. Victor's intermediary, Miss Monroe. The voice was different now. Polished neutrality was still there, but underneath it something had changed. A frequency. A pressure. "I'm calling to advise you that the situation has developed in a direction that makes it important you understand your current position." "I understand my current position," she said. "Mr. Wexler believes you may have made decisions in the last 24 hours that you would reconsider if you had complete information." A pause. "Graham is not acting under his father's direction tonight. I need you to understand that." Aaliyah's hand tightened on the phone. "Say that again," she said. "Graham has been—" The voice hesitated. First hesitation she'd ever heard from it. "He has been acting independently for the last 18 hours. Mr. Wexler has been attempting to reach him. He has not been successful." The car was moving through the dark access road, and the trees were close on both sides, and the information arriving through the phone was rearranging everything. "Victor doesn't know where Graham is," she said. "Mr. Wexler is concerned that his son's actions tonight may... The voice stopped. He is concerned about the consequences. Victor is calling me to protect Graham, Aaliyah said. Clarity of it hit her cold. He's calling me because he knows what Graham is about to do, and he can't stop him, and he's trying to use me to... She stopped herself. She thought about what Jun-ho had said in the federal building. Men like Graham do one of two things when they're cornered. They try to run, or they try to make the problem disappear. Graham had cut his father out. Graham was at the house. But if Graham had cut his father out, and Victor was calling Aaliyah in the middle of it, Victor was calculating something else entirely. Not protecting Graham, not protecting Aaliyah, but managing the collapse of his empire in the way that left the smallest possible surface area for criminal exposure. Victor was cutting Graham loose. The call was evidence. The call was Victor building a record that showed he had tried to prevent whatever Graham was about to do so that when it happened, he could stand in front of his lawyers and say he had acted in good faith to stop his son. I have to go, Aaliyah said. Miss Monroe, she ended the call, called the encrypted phone. Jun-ho's number. It rang twice. Graham cut Victor out, she said the moment he answered. Victor just called me. He's trying to distance himself from whatever Graham does tonight, which means Graham is operating without a leash. A pause on the other end. Brief. She could hear the night around Jun-ho through the phone wind. Leaves, the quality of outdoor silence. How many vehicles did you say, she said. 2 that I can see. Victor told me he can't reach Graham. She pressed the phone harder against her ear. If that's true, Graham didn't come with his father's hired crew. He came with his own people, who may not be operating under the same instructions about leaving witnesses. Another pause. Longer. Get to the Bronx, Jun-ho said. June, get to Nyla, he said. I can handle what's here. The car hit the end of the access road and turned onto the main route, and the trees fell away, and the November sky opened up above them, wide and dark and strung with the orange glow of distant suburbs. And Aaliyah sat in the back seat with both phones in her lap and the bandaged arm tight against her chest. And everything she'd built over the last 3 weeks in the hands of a man standing in the dark in a compromised house, waiting for Victor Wexler's unhinged son to come through the door. She called Massey. The federal agent answered on the first ring, which told Aaliyah that Massey had been waiting for exactly this call. Graham Wexler is at the property, Aaliyah said. He's cut his father out. Victor called me directly 20 minutes ago, trying to establish distance. I believe Graham's people may be armed with intent that goes beyond intimidation. She heard Massey stand up from whatever she'd been sitting in. The sound of movement, of coordination beginning. We have a unit 40 minutes out, Massey said. Jun-ho is on the property, Aaliyah said. I know, Massey said, and her voice had the quality of someone who had factored this into every calculation from the beginning. Ms. Monroe, get to your daughter and stay with Sungmi until I contact you personally. Do you understand? Yes, Aaliyah said. I need to hear you say you're not going back to that property. She looked out the car window at the dark road running ahead of them, taking her away from the house, away from Jun-ho, away from the convergence of everything she had started when she whispered, it wasn't an accident to a stranger across a restaurant table. I'm not going back, she said. The driver's eyes found hers briefly in the rearview mirror. He drove faster. Back at the property, the 2 vehicles on the approach road began to move at 9:47. Jun-ho watched from the upstairs window of the dark house, lights now off throughout, the television silenced. He had 4 people in the tree line, 2 at the rear of the property, 1 at each flank himself, inside. He had his phone with Massey's number cued. He had his mother's pocket watch in his jacket. Pocket. The way he always did when something important was happening. The way he had carried it for 20 years as the specific reminder of why he was doing whatever he was doing. The vehicles came through the gate. 3 men from the first vehicle, 2 from the second, then from the passenger side of the second, moving with the particular aggression of someone who has been containing his fury for days and has finally decided to stop. Graham Wexler. He was not dressed for a business meeting. He was dressed for the version of this that lived inside his head. Dark clothes, his father's arrogance worn like armor, the absolute conviction of a man who had never in his life experienced a consequence that held. He went to the front door. He did not knock. Jun-ho let him come inside. Let him stand in the dark front room of the house and feel the silence of a place that was empty of the people he had expected to find. Then Junho turned on the kitchen light. Graham spun. He saw Junho standing in the kitchen doorway with his hands at his sides and his face carrying exactly the expression that men who were about to make the worst mistake of their lives needed to see. Not anger, not threat, but the total, unperformative calm of someone who was already on the other side of whatever was about to happen. "Where is she?" Graham said. "Not here," Junho said. Graham's jaw worked. His hands were at his sides, and his hands were shaking slightly, which was not fear. Junho had seen enough fear to know the difference, but the physical manifestation of fury that had been building pressure for weeks and had just found a room to exist in. "I want the file," Graham said. "The photograph. Whatever she's been building. You're going to tell me where it is, and you're going to—" "It's already filed," Junho said. "Federal investigators. This afternoon." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man watching something he had believed he could still prevent evaporate in front of him. "You're lying," Graham said. "I'm not," Junho said. "She's a waitress," Graham said, and the contempt in it was so pure, so completely unexamined, that it almost sounded like grief. "She's nobody. She signed a statement. She had nothing. She had a photograph," Junho said. "She had a witness who was 12 feet away. She had your father calling her tonight to distance himself from you, which is now also on record." He paused. "She had enough. She's always had enough. You spent 3 weeks trying to convince her she didn't." Graham's face had gone through several things in the space of those seconds: disbelief, recalculation. The particular recalibration of a man who has just understood that he is standing in a room that was built specifically for him to stand in. He looked at the men who had come in with him. He looked at the kitchen doorway where Junho was standing. He looked at the windows and whatever he saw outside them, the stillness, the absence of movement, where movement should have been told him, in the language of someone who had been around enough controlled situations to recognize the shape of one, exactly what he had walked into. "You set this up," Graham said. "You set this up," Junho said. "You cut your father out, and you came here with people who don't share your father's appreciation for legal distance. And you walked through a gate that has been photographed and documented and is now part of a federal record." He took a step forward, not threatening, clarifying. "You came here to make Aaliyah Monroe disappear. That decision belongs to you. Not your father. Not a lawyer. You." Graham was breathing harder. The men who had come with him had stopped moving. They were reading the room the way men with some professional experience read rooms, and what they were reading was telling them something that Graham's fury had prevented him from reading on the approach. One of them, the older of the group, the one who moved with the specific economy of someone who had been doing this long enough to recognize when a situation had already been determined, took a step back toward the door. Junho watched him. "Don't," he said. Not loud. He didn't need loud. The man stopped. Outside, Junho's people came out of the tree line. They came quietly. No lights. No announcement. They simply materialized from the darkness at each window, at the door, in the spaces between where Graham's people were standing. Deprecating wood splitting, and the addition of their presence to the room performed the specific arithmetic that changed everything, without anyone needing to say the number out loud. Graham looked around him. He looked at his people, the count, the positioning, the way each one of them had gone very still. He looked at Junho, and Junho watched him understand, for possibly the first time in his life, what it felt like to be in a room where his name did not matter, and his father's money did not mother's 30 not reach, and there was no version of the next 30 seconds in which the situation resolved in his favor. Junho took his phone out. He called Massey. "Property secure," he said. "Graham Wexler is on site with 5 individuals. No one injured. Documentation complete." A pause on the other end. "Units are 12 minutes out," Massey said. "We'll be here," Junho said. He ended the call. He looked at Graham Wexler, who was still standing in the middle of the dark room with his hands at his sides and the specific expression of a man on whom consequence has just arrived after a lifetime of successful avoidance. Not horror, not shame, but something rawer and more disoriented than either. "Sit down," Junho said. Graham Wexler, whose father had owned half of Manhattan's mid-market residential property for 30 years, whose name had opened doors and closed investigations and rewritten events to suit his preferred version of reality, sat down on the floor of a dark living room outside the city, and waited for the sound of federal vehicles coming up the access road. Junho stood near the window. He put his hand in his jacket pocket. He felt the weight of his mother's watch there, solid and familiar, the stopped hands that had held the moment of her death for 2 decades. He had imagined this moment many times. The moment when the mechanism finally caught, when the thing he had been building since he was 21 years old arrived at its destination. He had imagined feeling something enormous. What he actually felt was quieter than that. He felt the weight of the watch in his hand. He felt the 12 minutes ticking down to the sound of tires on an access road. And somewhere in the Bronx, in a small apartment kitchen with flour on the floor and a cookie dough jar on the counter, a 6-year-old girl was waiting for her mother to come home, which meant that the 12 minutes were also the 12 minutes until Junho could get in his car and drive north and tell Aaliyah Monroe that it was over, and she could stop counting her breaths. The vehicles on the access road had their lights on now. Graham heard them. He looked up at Junho. "My father," he started. "Your father called Aaliyah Monroe tonight to create a paper trail that distances him from your actions," Junho said. "Your father is already deciding how much of you he can afford to protect and how much of you he needs to let go." He held Graham's gaze. "You've known your father your entire life. You tell me which way that calculation goes." Graham's face went through something that Junho had not expected to see there. Not fury, not the contempt that had characterized every interaction this man had ever had with someone he considered beneath him. Something that looked, briefly and unguardedly, like the face of a child who had just understood that the person he'd believed was protecting him had been using him all along. The federal vehicles came through the gate. Their headlights swept across the front windows of the house, moving through the dark room in a slow white arc that caught Graham Wexler's face in full exposure for exactly 1 second before passing on. In that second, Junho saw him clearly. Not the man who had poured scalding broth onto a woman's arm because she had refused him. Not Victor's weapon, or Victor's extension, or the physical manifestation of everything Junho had spent 20 years trying to dismantle. Just a man sitting on the floor in the dark, finally out of road, waiting for the knock on the door that was going to divide his life into before and after. Junho put the watch back in his pocket. He walked to the front door. He opened it before they knocked. Agent Massey was standing on the porch with 2 federal officers behind her and the cold November air coming in around all of them, and she looked at Junho with the expression of someone who had run enough operations to recognize when one had gone precisely as planned and was allowing herself, very briefly, to acknowledge it. "Mr. Kang," she said. "Agent Massey," he said. He stepped aside. She went in, and in the car moving north toward the Bronx through the November dark, Aaliyah Monroe felt her encrypted phone vibrate with a single text from a number she had memorized that morning. "It's done. Go be with Nyla." She pressed the phone against her sternum, closed her eyes. The driver took the exit north. Aaliyah arrived at the Bronx apartment at 11:14. She knew the exact time. She knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock on the encrypted phone for the last 40 minutes of the drive. Not obsessively, but with the particular awareness of someone who has learned that time is not abstract. It is the specific interval between when something is happening and when you can finally get to the person you need to get to. Sungmi opened the door before she knocked. The apartment smelled like burned sugar and vanilla, and something that had been in the oven too long, and the kitchen light was on, and there was flour on the hallway floor tracking out from the kitchen in 2 small sets of footprints, one adult, one child, and Aaliyah stood in the doorway, taking all of this in for approximately 1 second before Nyla came around the kitchen doorframe and stopped. She looked at her mother. Aaliyah looked at her daughter. Nyla crossed the hallway in 4 steps and put her arms around Aaliyah's waist, and Aaliyah pressed her right hand, the bandaged one, a sound like green wood splitting, the one that had been the measure of everything for the past several weeks, against the back of her daughter's head, and she felt the fingers close around the small skull with a completeness that meant something she couldn't have said out loud without her voice going somewhere. She didn't want it to go in the hallway of a Bronx apartment at 11 at night. "You smell like outside," Nyla said, muffled against her mother's jacket. "I was outside," Aaliyah said. "Cold outside, very cold." Nyla tightened her arms. Then, with the practicality that she deployed, When she sensed a conversation was approaching territory, she didn't know how to navigate. I made something. Sungmi says, "It's not terrible." Sungmi, standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel, had the expression of someone revising their statement slightly upward. I said it was good. I said it was actually good. She said not terrible first, Nyla said, while I laughed. It came out rough and too fast and not entirely controlled, and she pressed her mouth against the top of Nyla's head and let it finish itself, and Sungmi looked at the wall and gave her the 20 seconds it needed. She settled Nyla back into bed at midnight. Nyla had questions. She always had questions. It was constitutionally impossible for her to transition from activity to sleep without a full debrief of the evening, and Aaliyah answered them in the edited, age-appropriate way she had developed over years of having a curious child and a complicated life. Yes, everything was okay. Yes, they were going to stay here a little longer. Yes, the bakery plan was still the plan. Yes, tomorrow Nyla could show her the full version of whatever she had attempted in the kitchen. Mom, Nyla said from the dark. Yeah, your arm. What about it? Is it going to be okay? For real, not the version you say. Aaliyah sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about Dr. Sung's cautious optimism. She thought about the word tendon and the phrase full use and the conditional attached to both. The doctor thinks so, she said. If I do what she says. Are you going to do what she says? I'm going to try. Nyla was quiet for a moment. For the bakery, she said. You need both hands. I know, Aaliyah said. I know that. Another silence. Okay, Nyla said, and closed her eyes with the completeness of a child who has received the information she needed and can now release the day. Aaliyah sat on the edge of the bed for another 5 minutes after her daughter's breathing evened out. Then she went to the kitchen and sat at the table with a glass of water and her own company, which was, after everything, an unusual thing to have. Sung had gone to the other bedroom. The apartment was quiet. Aaliyah set her 2 phones on the table, her own and the encrypted one, and looked at them. The encrypted one had one unread message she hadn't opened yet. She'd felt it arrive during the drive, but hadn't looked at it because she'd been looking at the clock instead. She opened it now. It was from Junho, 2 sentences. Victor Wexler has retained crisis counsel. He's meeting with federal investigators tomorrow morning. She read it twice. She set the phone down. She put both hands flat on the table, the bandaged one and the good one, and looked at them side by side. The right hand, the one that had been the currency of this entire ordeal, the one that Victor's decision to protect his son had put at risk, moved stiffly but moved. The fingers opened. The fingers closed. Not completely, not without effort, but the mechanism was there. She was going to need a lawyer of her own by morning. She thought about that practically for 10 minutes. She knew one name, a woman, who had handled a housing discrimination case in her building 2 years ago and had the particular quality of someone who fought for people who couldn't afford to fight for themselves because it was the work she had chosen, not the work that paid most. She had kept the number in her phone with the vague, superstitious preservation of someone who hopes never to need something full suspecting they's will. She found it. She sent a text at 12:37 in the morning. She didn't expect a reply until morning and went to bed. The reply came at 12:51. I've been following the Wexler case. I had a feeling, call me at 7. Aaliyah set the phone on the nightstand. She lay in the dark of the strange bedroom in the Bronx apartment and looked at the ceiling and let the events of the past 24 hours run through her without trying to organize them, because some things needed to move through you before you could put them in order. She thought about Marcus Webb getting into a car on a Tuesday morning because a stranger asked him to. She thought about Owen Price sitting on his front steps in Astoria with his phone, face down on the concrete, having already decided. She thought about Victor Wexler calling her while his son drove to a house to do something that Victor needed on record as something he had tried to stop. She thought about Junho standing in that kitchen doorway with the expression of a man who was on the other side of whatever was about to happen. She slept. The federal investigation into Victor Wexler moved with the particular, deliberate momentum of something that had been building pressure for a long time and had now found the seam through which it could finally push. Victor met with federal investigators on a Thursday morning in a conference room 2 floors above where Aaliyah had sat with Massey. He brought 3 lawyers. He was dressed with the particular precision of a man who understood That appearance was information, and who had spent 60-odd years making sure the information his appearance communicated was one of legitimacy and institutional weight. The investigators had Aaliyah's testimony. They had Owen's formal statement and Marcus Webb's formal statement. They had the call records showing Corbett's communication with Victor's legal team from the third day after the incident. They had the corporate documentation that Junho had spent 20 years assembling. Now submitted legal channels with provenance documentation that Massey's team had reviewed and cleared. They also had Victor's own phone call, the one he had made to Aaliyah while Graham was driving to the property. His lawyers had advised him to make that call as a record of good faith intervention. It had created exactly the record they intended, and simultaneously confirmed Victor's advanced knowledge of his son's plans, which was not a thing that a man who had genuinely been trying to stop those plans would have had. Massey told Aaliyah about this afterward, in a brief call that was characteristically direct. His lawyers tried to characterize the call as paternal concern, Massey said. It's going to be a difficult argument to sustain, given the specific content and timing. He thought he was being clever, Aaliyah said. He's been clever for 40 years, Massey said. Clever becomes a liability when you've been doing it long enough that you believe it's the same thing as invincible. The weeks that followed were not cinematic. They were paperwork and meetings and phone calls that ran long and left Aaliyah tired in a way that was different from the fatigue of Sterling House doubles that had been the exhaustion of the body, which was straightforward. This was the exhaustion of sustained attention in rooms where every word mattered, and the people across the table were measuring everything you said against everything you'd said before. Her lawyer whose name was Patricia Chen, and who had, as Aaliyah discovered, successfully litigated 3 previous cases involving Wexler-connected property management entity, handled the legal aspects with the efficient intensity of someone running on insufficient sleep and sufficient outrage. She was 44, spoke in precise, clipped sentences, and had a way of looking at opposing counsel that was not hostile but was extremely specific, kind of look that communicated exactly how many of their arguments she had already read and considered and found wanting. Under Chen's guidance, Aaliyah filed a civil suit against Graham Wexler and Sterling's house's ownership entity for the assault. She filed a separate complaint regarding the falsified medical documentation, which triggered a medical board investigation into Nathaniel Crow that ran parallel to the federal case. Crow's recantation collapsed within 3 weeks. It collapsed because Marcus Webb's testimony placed him in the room with Victor the morning after the incident, which contradicted his claim that his initial assessment had been independently formed. And it collapsed because a second physician won, who had been brought in by Dr. Sung to consult on Aaliyah's treatment-provided documentation, establishing that the nature and pattern of the injury was inconsistent with any mechanism of accidental employee negligence, a conclusion that required no interpretation of disputed events and could not be walked back by a lawyer's affidavit. Crow's legal team requested a meeting with federal investigators within 48 hours of the second physician's documentation entering the record. Dennis Corbett retained his own counsel and entered into a cooperation agreement. He had been living, it emerged, with the specific and compounding weight of someone who had made a decision under pressure and had been paying the interior cost of it every day since. His cooperation agreement required his full account of Victor's instructions, the specific language used, the sequence of events following the incident. He provided it without apparent resistance, with the manner of a man performing a long overdue correction of an error that had been eating him. Aaliyah did not feel vindicated by this. She felt the particular complicated thing that happens when someone who wronged you admits it. Not the satisfaction she might have expected, but something more ambivalent, the recognition that Corbett had been operating under his own fear, and that fear was not an excuse, but was also not nothing, and that the world was built of people making terrible decisions under pressure, and then living inside those decisions for years, and that her job in this case was not to be the moral arbiter of everyone who had failed her, but to make sure the record reflected what had actually happened. She said as much to Chen. Chen looked at her across the conference table and said, You should consider saying exactly that in your victim impact statement. And those words are close to them. It's more devastating than anything more obviously righteous. Aaliyah thought about it. It's just true, she said. That's what makes it devastating, Chen said. The meeting with Victor happened in the third month. Not a confrontation, nothing that dramatic or clean. It happened because Victor requested it through legal channels in what his lawyers characterized as an attempt at direct resolution, and because Chen recommended Aaliyah attend, and because Aaliyah, when she considered it, found that she wanted to. Not for closure. She had stopped believing in closure as a concept somewhere around the third week of sleeping in strange places with her daughter. What she wanted was simpler and more specific. She wanted to look at the man who had come to her break room and threatened her apartment and her livelihood while her arm was infected and burning. And she wanted to be the person in the room who was not afraid. She got that. Victor arrived with 2 lawyers and the physical diminishment that had happened to him over the preceding months. Not dramatic, not collapse, but the specific compression that occurs when a man who has been running at a certain atmospheric pressure has that pressure removed. He was smaller than she remembered. He sat across the conference table from her and Chen and looked at Aaliyah with an expression that she spent a moment trying to identify and then identified. It was the expression of a man who had genuinely not expected to be here. Not in the room specifically, in the situation, at this juncture in his life. He had spent 60 years building something that he believed was solid, and it had turned out to be load-bearing in a structure with a cracked foundation, and the crack had opened, and now he was sitting across from the waitress, whose arm he had used as leverage. He made an offer through his lawyers. It was significant. A civil settlement that Chen later described as the number you offer when you're genuinely scared of what goes in the record. Aaliyah looked at the number. She looked at Victor. No, she said. His lead lawyer began to explain the terms more fully, as though the issue were comprehension rather than decision. I understood the number, Aaliyah said. The answer is no. Victor looked at her. It was the first time they had made direct eye contact across the table. His lawyers had been handling the eye contact, the way lawyers do, as though direct visual engagement were a tactical asset to be rationed. Ms. Monroe, Victor said. His voice had the texture of old money smooth, controlled the voice of a man who had been listened to in rooms his entire life. I'd encourage you to consider Mr. Wexler, Aaliyah said. Your son deliberately poured boiling broth onto my arm. You came to my workplace and threatened my housing while the infection was spreading. Your physician falsified my medical record. Your people monitored my phone communications from the 3rd day after the incident. You called me at 11 at night to create a legal record of your quote-unquote good faith while your son's driving to a property to do something you already knew about. She paused. I understand the offer. I'm declining it because accepting it means the public record of this case ends before the full public record exists. That's what your number buys. It doesn't buy resolution. Buys silence. Victor was very still. I'm not for sale, she said. I know you've been operating under the assumption that everyone is for sale at the right price. I understand why you believe that. You've been right about it a lot. You're not right about me. A long silence. His lawyers exchanged something that was not quite a look. Victor picked up the glass of water in front of him. Set it down. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. What do you want? He said. Not through his lawyers. Directly, the voice stripped of its smooth management. I want everything that happened to go into the public record, she said. I want the employees of yours who were intimidated and silenced to see that what was done to them has a name and a consequence. I want the people who lived in your buildings and were threatened with eviction when they complained about habitability to know that someone finally said it out loud in a room where it mattered. She held his gaze. I want your son to answer for what he did to my arm in front of a room full of people who chose not to see it. And I want you to answer for what you built and what you used it for. She paused once. That's what I want. Your money doesn't cover it. The settlement meeting ended 20 minutes later. Chen didn't say anything in the elevator on the way down. She stood beside Aaliyah with her briefcase and her coat and her very still face, and when they hit the lobby and the door opened, she said, the number they offered would have taken care of your daughter's entire education. I know, Aaliyah said. You know the trial will be hard. I know. Chen looked at her. Okay, she said. And then more quietly, good. The trial was hard. Victor's legal team was exactly what a man who had been building financial insulation for 40 years could afford: experienced, methodical, deeply uninterested in the human dimensions of the case and deeply interested in its procedural vulnerabilities. They challenged chain of custody on the photograph. They challenged Owen's credibility with his employment history. They characterized Marcus Webb's testimony as the account of a peripheral observer whose recollection had been shaped by subsequent contact with interested parties. They were skilled at their jobs. They were also, Chen had told Aaliyah at the outset, going to lose. Not because skilled lawyers always lose to the truth. They didn't, and Aaliyah knew better than to believe otherwise. But because the aggregate weight of the documentation, the testimony, sound, and Victor's own behavior during the preceding months had assembled something that was not reducible to a single challenged piece of evidence. You could argue against the photograph. You could not argue against the photograph and the medical expert, and Owen Price and Marcus Webb and Dennis Corbett and the 17 other former Wexler employees who, once the case was public and the door was open, came through it. 1 became 5, 5 became 11, 11 became 17. The pattern that emerged was the thing that broke the defense's coherence. Not any single event, not the incident at Sterling House alone, but the repetition of it workers across Victor's industrial facilities, tenants across his residential properties, employees across his hospitality entities, all describing variations of the same mechanism. Something happened. The official version was different from what happened, and the distance between those two things was maintained through the specific application of economic pressure on people who could not afford to fight. Aaliyah's arm was the face of it. But the trial was about 20 years of decisions, made on the premise that the people hurt by them didn't matter enough to be remembered. She gave her victim impact statement on a Tuesday in February, in a courtroom that was full in the particular way that courtrooms get full when a case has become the kind of thing that people follow. Not just lawyers and journalists, but the kind of public that recognizes when something is being said that needed to be said. She had thought about what Chen said, about using her own words, the ones she'd said in the conference room. She had also thought about what mattered most, which was not delivering a statement that was strategically optimal, but delivering one that was true. She stood at the podium and looked at the room and did not look at Victor specifically, because she did not want to perform for him. She had not done this for him. She said, "I signed a false statement because I was afraid of losing my daughter's home. I went to work for 21 days with an infected arm because I was afraid of losing the income that kept us housed and fed. I did not go to a hospital because the man who had the power to put us on the street had already made clear that the cost of telling the truth would be paid by my 6-year-old daughter." She paused. "I want to be clear about something that I think gets lost in cases like this. I was not uniquely vulnerable. I was ordinarily vulnerable. I was a working mother with rent due and a child to protect. Victor Wexler did not pick me because I was unusually weak. He picked me because I was in the way, and his entire operation for 40 years was built on the premise that people who are simply in the way will choose to move rather than fight." She looked at the room. "I almost did," she said. "Most of the people you've heard from in this case almost did. That's what I want on the record. Not that we were brave. That we were scared and chose to go forward anyway, which is a much more ordinary thing and a much more honest description of how this actually works." She stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet in the specific way that quiet happens when something has been said and needs a moment to settle before anyone responds to it. Graham Wexler was sentenced separately. His case had moved faster, partly because the evidence was cleaner, and partly because Graham, without his father's full strategic apparatus behind him, had entered into a plea agreement that acknowledged the assault and the subsequent conspiracy to intimidate a witness. His lawyers had negotiated aggressively and gotten terms that felt to Aaliyah like they were priced at the intersection of what the law allowed and what his father could still afford to spend on him. She did not feel satisfied by Graham's sentence in Bidets in the way she had once imagined she would. She felt the thing she had described in her statement, ordinary, tired, relieved in a way that was less triumph, and more the feeling of putting down something heavy after a long carry, splitting. The kind of relief that doesn't feel good immediately, but simply feels like the absence of a weight that had been so constant she'd forgotten it was there. Victor's sentencing came in late March. His lawyers had argued everything available to them: age, health, the absence of a prior criminal record, the complexity of a large corporate organization. and the difficulty of attributing specific decisions to a single individual. They were not wrong that these were real arguments. They were wrong that they would be sufficient. Victor was sentenced. He stood when the sentence was read with the physical composure of a man who had spent his entire life controlling the impression he made in rooms, and the composure held, and he sat back down, and his lawyers flanked him with their practiced expressions of professional neutrality. And Aaliyah sat in the gallery and watched it happen, and felt the particular, complicated weight of something ending that had cost more than she'd had to spend and had been worth spending anyway. Outside the courthouse, Chen handed her a coffee from the cart at the corner. Aaliyah took it with her right hand, not without difficulty. The grip was imperfect, the fingers not fully cooperative, the tendon damage expressing itself in the specific, quotidian language of things that are improved but not resolved. A sound had been honest from the beginning about what complete recovery meant and did not mean. There was a version of this hand that would function well and a version that would function adequately, and neither version was the hand she'd had before, and she had made peace with that, the way you make peace with things that are true, not by deciding they don't matter, but by deciding they don't determine everything. "What now?" Chen said. Aaliyah looked at the courthouse steps and the early spring sky above them, cold still, but different from the November cold that had been present for every significant moment of the last several months. Something in it had changed. Not warmth exactly, just the absence of the specific heaviness that winter carried. "Now I find a space," she said. Chen looked at her. "For the bakery," Aaliyah said. "The civil settlement, which was determined by the court after the criminal sentencing and which was structured to include multiple plaintiff groups from the broader Wexler employee and tenant case, provided Aaliyah with the foundation. Not the whole of it. She had thoughts about that, specific thoughts she had been carrying since the conference room, where she'd turned down Victor's private offer, and those thoughts had to do with the difference between money that was given to make something go away and money that was ordered by a court as an acknowledgement of a harm that was real and documented and mattered. The second kind she could build with. The space was in Brooklyn. She found it in April. A small street-level unit in a neighborhood that was still becoming itself, with good bones and bad lighting, and a kitchen that needed work, and a front window that caught the afternoon light in a way that made everything inside it look warmer than it was. The landlord was skeptical. Patricia Chen sat across from the landlord and produced documentation of the civil settlement and the business loan Aaliyah had been approved for, and the lease history that confirmed Aaliyah Monroe had never in her life missed a payment on anything, and the landlord became less skeptical. She signed the lease on a Thursday in April. She called Nyla from outside the space while Nyla was still in school, leaving a voicemail because 7-year-olds didn't answer their phones during the school day, saying, "The space is ours." Nyla's reply came at 3:15, 3 exclamation points and a cookie emoji, and then, 30 seconds later, a follow-up text that said, "I need to see the oven situation." The renovation took 3 months. Aaliyah was present for every day of it, which was not the most efficient approach to a renovation, but was the only approach she was capable of. She had been at a remove from her own life for too long. She needed to be inside the work, handling the materials, making the decisions that were hers to make. She hired people where she needed expertise, the electrical, the plumbing, the kitchen equipment installation, and did everything else herself or with Owen, who appeared the first Saturday with tools and no explanation and worked alongside her for 8 straight hours and said, at the end of the day, that he had always been good with his hands and needed something to do on weekends anyway. Marcus Webb came the second Saturday. He and Owen had developed, in the months of the investigation and the trial, the specific bond that forms between people who have shared a significant and terrifying experience and emerged from it on the same side. Not friendship exactly, not yet. A sound like green wood splitting, but the particular mutual recognition of people who know something important about each other that most of the world doesn't know. The sign went up on the last Friday in July. Monroe and daughter. White letters on dark wood. Simple. The kind of sign that looked like it had been there for years on the day it was installed. Nyla had chosen the font. She had approached this decision with the seriousness it deserved, presenting her mother with 11 options in a handmade booklet that included commentary on each, and the font she chose was the one that was clean and not too fancy and would look good from across the street when someone was deciding whether to come in. People decide from across the street, Nyla explained. We need to be readable from across the street. Aaliyah had agreed. She looked at the sign from across the street, standing on the opposite sidewalk in the late July afternoon, with the sun coming at a low angle that caught the white letters and made them glow slightly. She stood there for a while. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the specific, unspectacular thing that she had been moving toward for 8 months, which was the feeling of standing on ground she had built herself, under a name she had chosen, with the work she intended to do clearly labeled above the door. It was enough. It was actually more than enough. The opening happened on a Saturday in August. The smell came first butter and vanilla, and the specific warm sweetness of bread that has been baking since 5 in the morning, and it reached the sidewalk and the street, and apparently went further than that, because by the time Aaliyah turned the open sign over at 8 o'clock, there were already people on the sidewalk who had followed their noses from 2 blocks away. Nyla was in the kitchen. She had been in the kitchen since 5:30, which was 30 minutes before Aaliyah, which was a thing. Aaliyah noted and filed as evidence of something that made her chest feel full in a way that had no useful name. The first tray of the morning was cookies. Nyla's design, Nyla's recipe, after months of refinement, that had put a thin, permanent layer of flour on the ceiling of whatever kitchen they were occupying. Aaliyah pulled the tray with both hands, right hand imperfect, left hand compensating the coordination between them, something that had been rebuilt over months of physical therapy into a working, if imperfect, system, and set it on the cooling rack and felt the heat from it rise against her face. Nyla appeared at her elbow. "First customer," she said. "That's me. You promised." Aaliyah looked at her. 7 years old. Flour on her elbow and her nose, and, for reasons Aaliyah could not account for, a small patch of it on her left ear. Completely serious about the terms of a promise made years ago across a kitchen table in an apartment that no longer existed in the form they had occupied it. Aaliyah took a cookie from the tray. She handed it to her daughter. Nyla bit into it and chewed and did not perform a reaction, which was her methodology. She assessed things privately before issuing a verdict. Then she said, "Good, but the sugar ratio in the next batch needs to come up by about 10%. "Noted," Aaliyah said. Junho came in at 10. He came alone, which was the way he had been doing things more often in the months. Since Graham's arrest and Victor's sentencing, the restructuring of his organization, the withdrawal from its violent operations, had been a process rather than an event, the slow and deliberate separation of what could be rebuilt on legitimate ground from what needed to be released entirely. It was not finished. It might not be finished for years. But it was happening with the same patience that had characterized everything he had ever built, and it was happening because he had chosen it rather than because anyone had required it of him. He sat at a table near the window, the corner one, with the afternoon light. Aaliyah brought him coffee and sat across from him for a moment, which she could do because the morning rush had settled into the comfortable mid-morning rhythm of a space that was finding its pace, and Owen was behind the counter, handling the orders with a competence that surprised neither of them. Junho wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He looked at the room, the warm light through the front window, at the sign visible through it from inside, at Nyla moving through the kitchen in the back, with the proprietary efficiency of someone on her own territory, at Owen explaining something to a customer with the specific animated focus of someone who has found a thing they didn't know they needed. "Your mother would have come here," Aaliyah said. Junho looked at her. "She would have been here every week," Aaliyah said. "She would have had opinions about the coffee temperature." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, she would have had opinions about everything." "That's what I thought," Aaliyah said. He reached into his jacket pocket. He set his mother's pocket watch on the table between them. The old case, the worn edges, the face with its stopped hands that had been stopped for 20 years. Aaliyah looked at it. She had seen it once before, the night he told her about Jeon, and she had not touched it. It was not a thing you touched without being invited. "She bought it at a market in Busan the year before we left Korea," he said. "She said a person needed to know what time it was. She said people who didn't know what time it was were always late for their own lives." He turned it over in his hands. "Stopped the day she died. I never had it repaired because he paused. I told myself I was keeping it as it was. I think I was keeping myself as I was. Aaliyah looked at him. He turned the crown of the watch between his thumb and his index finger. He wound it. The mechanism caught on the third turn. Something inside it shifted, found its groove, locked into the sequence it had been built for, and then, tick, a pause, tick. Aaliyah watched the second hand move, hesitate, move again, find its rhythm. She felt something in her chest that was not grief and was not joy, but existed in the space between them where the honest things live. Junho set the watch on the table. They sat with the sound of it for a moment. I'm closing the shipping operation, he said. The underground part. The piece that Victor's people used to say, I was no different from the people I dealt with. He said it without self-pity or performance. Going to cost more than money. I know, she said. The legitimate businesses can sustain themselves. The restructuring is already in process. But the other part, he looked at the watch. It doesn't happen overnight. Nothing worth doing does, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them on the table, the pocket watch ticked. It was not a dramatic moment. It was the opposite of dramatic two people sitting across from each other in a bakery in Brooklyn on a Saturday morning in August, with coffee getting cold and the sound of Nyla adjusting her sugar ratio in the kitchen, and Owen describing something to a customer with his hands. Specific, unhurried recognition that what had grown between them in the months of shared crisis and incremental trust, and the 1,000 small observations that constitute actually knowing a person, was not going to be resolved in a single moment or a single conversation. It was going to be the next thing. After everything else, the next thing, built the same way the bakery had been built, and the case had been built, and the person Aaliyah had become on the other side of Sterling House, had been built slowly with attention, without the expectation of ease. You're coming for dinner Thursday, Aaliyah said. Am I, he said. Not a question. Nyla has been working on something. She needs an honest critic, and Owen is too encouraging. Junho looked toward the kitchen, where Nyla was visible through the pass-through window, deeply absorbed in whatever she was adjusting. I can do that, he said. I know, Aaliyah said. She picked up his coffee cup and took it back to the counter for a refill. She walked with her right arm slightly raised, the way she always did now. The physical therapist had explained that the nerve adaptation would take longer than the structural healing, and that her body would find its own compensations. The arm moved. The hand moved. Not perfectly, not without effort, but within the range of someone who intended to use them for a long time and was going to be patient about it. She refilled the cup. She brought it back. Outside the front window, the Brooklyn street moved at its own particular pace. The Saturday morning foot traffic, someone walking a dog that had opinions about the direction they were going, a woman pushing a stroller with one hand and her phone in the other, two old men in front of the barber shop, 3 doors down, having the same conversation they appeared to have every Saturday morning. The city kept moving. Inside Monroe and daughter, Nyla emerged from the kitchen with the second tray of the morning and announced that the sugar ratio adjustment had been correct and that she was prepared to accept feedback from customers who were qualified to give, by which she meant anyone willing to be honest. A woman at the nearest table held out her hand. Nyla gave her a cookie with the solemnity of someone conducting a controlled experiment. The woman tasted it, looked up, said, "This is very good." Nyla noted this. 11% would have been too much, she said to her mother, with the satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. Aaliyah leaned against the counter. Junho's watch ticked quietly on the table by the window. She looked at the room she had built, the warm light, the sign visible through the glass. Her daughter, moving through the space with the proprietary confidence of someone who had been planning this for 3 years and had arrived at the execution ready. She looked at her right hand, resting on the counter. She straightened the arm. Not all the way. Not quite. But further than it had gone in November. Further than it had gone in December or January. Further than the night in Dr. Sung's clinic when the word permanent had been in the room, and she had looked at her hand and thought about cookie trays and the bakery dream and a 6-year-old who baked with too much sugar and unshakable conviction. She straightened it. She held it there. Once there had been a restaurant where 200 people had watched a woman struggle to hold a tray and had decided, collectively, invisibly, that the thing happening in front of them was not happening. Now there was a bakery on a Brooklyn street on a Saturday morning in August, and the woman who had stood in that restaurant was standing in a room she had built, with her name above the door and her daughter's laughter coming from the kitchen, and a man who had spent 20 years carrying a stopwatch sitting at a corner table while time moved again around him. The arm held. The watch ticked. Outside, New York kept doing what New York did, enormous and indifferent, and full of ordinary people making ordinary decisions that were, some of them, the most important decisions of their lives. Inside, Aaliyah Monroe came out of the kitchen, with flour on her ear and a cookie in each hand and the absolute undiminished certainty of a child who had always known this was where they were going. She gave her mother one. Aaliyah took it with her right hand. She held it. She did not drop it.